along the same lines. The content is quite different, and that's why I gave it to all of you to look at. I would appreciate it if you did not share it. Okay, they're all drafts. They don't really want that information out. Well, the regs you can, because they're done. But the memorandum of understanding, it's not done yet. They don't want it everywhere. So, yeah, which is why some of you asked me for it. I'm not really wanting to give that out to the public because it's not mine to sell. But it will give you an opportunity to kind of look and compare what we've done with what they did. What was interesting was they took the process before the Planning Commission without a completed MOU. And initially, the Planning Commission said, well, whoa, we can't approve the process without the MOU. But then, as they discussed it, in the end, they actually did approve it on a 5-1, and the reasoning behind it was that the MOU is a contract between the board and the operator. And so the fact of the matter is the Planning Commission will likely not have a lot to say about that anyway, or maybe anything to say about that. I think the other reason is that they were feeling like they wanted to make some progress. So I wanted to share that with you because I wondered what everybody's feelings about that might be for our own situation if we have difficulty completing the MOU within the next couple weeks. At the moment, what's scheduled is the Planning Commission is scheduled for the 4th of April, which gives us 3 weeks, 3 meetings, and a 4th if we really need it before the Planning Commission. And then the board on the 24th, I believe it is, because the point here is to try to get it finished, get before the board by April, the end of April. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of schedule. I had hoped to have a lot more done on the regs, but I just haven't. I just can't get to it. It's just too much. So Tony wrote up an MOU for water based on our thoughts last time. Our last meeting we talked about injection wells and which ones would be minors and which ones would be majors. And if we're going to have it be a minor, then there needs to be an MOU tied to it and all that good stuff. I just got it this evening, so I haven't read it all the way through yet either. So that's in there. A couple of small things were sent to me since our last meeting that I have fixed in here. But the most of the major stuff, like the injection wells and the specific language for the injection wells and stuff like that, is just in there as a, here's what we talked about. I'll put the language together later. Sorry, I haven't had time to do it. So that's kind of where we're at. This information, the little picture on here, came directly from the EPA, and I thought it was really helpful in explaining the difference between the wells. In truth, there's really only two. Whether it's a repurposed well, that was an oil well and they're now using for just an injection well or not, it's still a well that is associated with the extraction of oil and gas. So that's really one category. And the other category is the disposal well, which has nothing to do with the extraction of oil. It really is just a place where they take their waste. So that kind of falls in line with what we talked about, that it was really two categories and that the disposal well would be a major and that anything that was extraction related would be a minor. So, what else? I went to the local designee training on Wednesday, which was quite good. And there was some really interesting information from the CDPAG, and I'm going to actually the Colorado Department of Health and Environment.
Education.
Public Health and Environment. There it is. He was great, and I'm actually going to approach the commissioners to see if they'd like him to come in and do a presentation, because his presentation was wonderful. And he addressed, and Rick will appreciate this, too bad you weren't able to hear that, and if I do it, I'll make sure you know when it is. Thank you.
Bring us at 6:30.
We're just getting. Anyway, he gave a great talk, and a couple things that were really interesting to find out was we've had a lot of people ask us, well, where did 1320 come from or whatever. So people ask, well, where did 500 come from? Is there any science behind that? And COGCC said, nope. And the reason is because there isn't any data, right? And so they pretty much arrived at a number that everybody was equally mad about. Is pretty much how and that's really what they said. But the good news is that Garfield County has invested $1 million. Of course, they're the number 2 oil and gas county in the state, so they have $1 million.
No, Garfield County, that's Grangeville, right?
That's what?
That's up around Grangeville?
Yes. Members ring.
Yeah. So anyway, they invested $1 million. The industry kicked in $800,000, and they have Colorado State University doing a study that was really interesting. It's really the first of its kind, where they're going to study the effects on air quality specific to oil and gas. They monitor, a lot of places around the state, but they monitor for a lot of things. This will be specific to oil and gas, and what they're going to do is they're going to take the seasons into account, take the winds into account, and they're going to move in ever widening distances from the well until they find the point where the air meets all of the minimum qualifications. And that will help us with that whole setback thing of being able to figure out how the air is affected, if at all. Okay. So that was kind of cool. It's probably going to take a couple of years for that study, but at least we have something scientific to look at and make some determinations by. So I thought that was pretty cool. I'm going to try to get the guy to talk. I said that already. I'm trying to remember. Said one other thing that I thought was really interesting. Well, anyway, what I found out was that CDPHE and COGCC are working pretty closely together, which I did not realize that there was that much interaction between them. So they are aware of the air things, Rick. They're aware. It's a question, but they don't have the studies. So I also found out that LGD is a full-time job, so I don't know what I'm going to do. But anyway, so that's what I got. Just kind of wanted to let you guys know what I found at the meeting. Oh, the other thing was there was only about 5 people at the Arapahoe meeting, which surprised me, public. And I was like, that's really weird. Until the next morning when I turned on the radio and found out that Fort Collins had banned hydrofracking. And I said, oh, that's where they all were. So I don't know that really gave us a very good idea, which I was hoping to get a good idea of the public's response to this idea, since it's so similar to our own. I didn't really get that. In fact, the only person to talk was a lawyer for the industry. So anyway, that's what happened.
Okay. So what are we going to do tonight? Are we just going to pick up where we left
Well, I
off?
don't think so. I think we're going to back up a little bit. I had some calls after our meeting that we might want to revisit. Maybe go back to, let me find one now. Go back to where we first started talking about injection wells and make sure everybody's okay with that. And maybe revisit the dust mitigation idea.
Carol, can I make one comment?
Sure.
Thanks. John Campbell again, Southwestern. So one of the biggest difference, though, at Arapahoe County is you're right that they did approve the rules prior to approving the MOU, but their rules are much more in line with the state than what you've attempted to do here in Elbert County.
Right.
So they're very, very simple rules.
The content is very different. It's only 6 pages.
Okay.
It really, and the current MOU that I have, which I'm sure is not very current, to be honest with you, kind of came to me through back alley mechanisms. I'm sure it's not as new as it could be. I did, however, get to talk to Diane Coxis, who's the oil and gas planner over there, and I asked her about the dust mitigation, because I got a lot of calls about the dust mitigation question, and they haven't even talked about it yet.
The dust mitigation is where we kind of left off last time. And the more I thought about it,
the more I thought. I think that because Southwestern, they're Renegade, great name though, but Renegade, Accountable Phillips, all have been good people to discuss this with while they're here, but on the other hand, if we put that into regulations, we really don't have any way of backing this up. We have no way of measuring the content of what's going on there, and from the standpoint of just clearly as a citizen, it seems that anything goes on the ground is unacceptable. So I think it's something that should be moved to the MOU. And I can understand from what you're saying here why Arapahoe County went with a minimal amount of regulations and move stuff over to the MOU, because that's a negotiable thing for all companies, because not all companies are created equal
Actually, there's very little in the MOU.
at this point.
The only thing the MOU
No,
talks
in
about is
Arapahoe,
kids.
there's nothing in the MOU about that.
There's nothing in the MOU about
No,
dust mitigation. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be.
Yeah.
Because remember, theirs is not finished. But they're not quoting them, they said they feel they're 99% there.
For us, yeah,
Well, I guess, Paul, I mean, I thought that, maybe it was John last time. Well, no, not mine. Well, I'm looking at some language Tony has in the field about values.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if we get the producers to do the testing, and we have defined values, and Tony's proposed some language, which I haven't seen till this evening, but
Yeah.
Somebody has.
Yeah.
I really don't want to talk about water disposal MOU until we've all had a chance to read it.
Okay, but I actually wasn't really intending to do that. I was intending to go back to...
Give us a page.
Well, we ended, I think, on page 13.
So we're into the regulation.
Right on 13? I'm sorry.
We're in the regulation.
we just talked about dust mitigation.
And I think that, do we want to revisit injection wells, or is everybody all right with, again, I'm sorry I did not get a chance to actually write language, but we discussed reorganizing the major and minor oil and gas
Yeah,
facilities
take
to
me to a page.
include, not 7, I'm sorry,
Oh.
page 7. So we discussed reorganizing to include a separate section specific to the 3 types of injection wells, except I think that there really are only 2.
Well, there are only 2, except that there are 3 circumstances.
Yes, but I think that whether you're drilling a well as an injection well, or what do they call it, something management,
So are we talking about...
resource management, level management, what do they call that? I gave all my copies away.
Are we talking about B on page 7, little b?
under major.
Yes, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, not really, because that was specific language, any centralized treatment, recycling, or water disposal facility and associated pipelines. That was very specific language. But then after we did that, we talked about maybe having a separate section specific to injection wells. And I would have written that, but I didn't have time. But if you look at the EPA, whether it's a repurposed well, in other words, it was an oil well and they changed it to an injection well, maybe it's not producing very good, to enhance the other wells, or it's a brand new injection well. It's still an injection well that has to do with the extraction of oil and gas. So, based on our conversation last time, we decided that that could be a minor, right? But that it would have, as a minor, if it was eligible for an administrative process, there would have to be an associated MOU. And also, we agreed that it would expand the notification area to 1 mile. Those were the 2 things that we decided. And we sort of left the disposal wells pretty much the way they already were, in that they're going to be a major only.
Well,
Straight disposal.
Yeah, there was a 3rd category that was discussed.
The 3rd category was, John brought up, said that, well, what happens if we have an oil well and we want to switch it to an injection well?
Yes.
Well, they're going to have to get a permit from the state anyway to do that.
Of course.
And so we said, okay, well, what I'm saying is, in my view, regardless of whether it's new or repurposed, it's still related to extraction and should be minor.
Just as a matter of detail, it's actually a permit from the Fed, because all Class 2 injection wells, which
Right.
includes enhanced recovery wells, which include regular oil and gas injection wells, they are all enforced and regulated by the Fed. So
But the state actually does it. Okay, it's based on federal regulations.
1995, that
Right.
was delegated to the state
Right.
for enforcement, but it's still regulated by the EPA.
Right, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I wanted everyone's input on whether that was how you remember us doing it.
So
And
let
if everybody's
me
okay
make
with
sure I understand. So you're saying a disposal well that is related to oil and gas extraction? No, we've got a language issue.
Well, the EPA calls them injection wells and disposal wells, which is how I've always referred to them.
Yeah,
No,
no,
the EPA doesn't do that. The
Well,
EPA has injection wells. What you have in front of you is a list that shows the 4 injection wells in Elbert County, now by Agate. And there are 2 types. One is a standard Class 2 injection well, which is exactly what it sounds like. Water comes up one well and oil and gas taken out, the water goes back down the injection well. The second kind is called an enhanced recovery well, which is also one out by Agate. Okay, that's where you maybe have, and this is very hypothetical, I'm not an oil and gas engineer, but you have a number of wells around, you want to increase the pressure in the formation so the oil and gas comes up in your other wells, so you have an enhanced injection well, enhanced recovery injection well. You put water down here and it causes the other wells to perform better. Is that fair?
yeah, that's called,
Those are the 2 types.
that's a water injection well that is typical for enhanced recovery.
Yes, sir.
Now you said, and the first one is right, that is for, you say, separate the water and from the hydrocarbons and you re-inject it in the ground. Then the third one is what is called the classical commercial disposal well, where somebody, an operator, sets up the collection of waters from several operators and disposes of it in the ground.
I get that, but I think that we're overcomplicating it, okay? Because the problem, when we talked about injection wells initially, was with the wells that are for all intents and purposes a dump, an underground dump. And that those wells are what everyone had concerns about. So,
And those are Class 1, not
no,
Class 2.
they're not. They're
Class
not. If you read the EPA thing, everything for oil and gas is a Class 2. Everything.
Right.
Oh,
I want to
yes,
make
yes.
sure you understand. When you talk about a general disposal well, meaning medical waste.
No, I'm talking about related to
General
oil.
disposal wells are Class 1.
I'm talking about related to oil and gas. And all oil and gas wells, injection wells, are Class 2. But the EPA breaks them in basically into 2 groups. That's those that are commercial, that are not related to extraction of oil, other than they take the waste from that. And the other that is associated with the stimulation of other wells or getting rid of the water that they produced when they extracted the oil. So they're related with the extraction of oil to the related.
The reason I addressed that language, and I think it's really an important point to make, and that is Mr. Cruzan last time, or perhaps with somebody on that side of the table, was concerned about having a well that anybody can come in and willy-nilly, if you will, okay, dump waste, not oil and gas waste, not things that are spun out of an oil and gas extraction, but we're talking commercial was the term that was used, commercial dump facility. That's a Class 1 well.
Is that your concern, Paul?
That's a Class 1 well.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
That
But
you don't have a problem with other oil and gas
Well,
facilities
if
coming
we
in?
go back to what Mr. Creasy had said, is that I can see one way we could control this in our own way, because I don't have a problem with injection wells, but I do have a problem with, let's say, John has an injection well, and then 10 other operators, different companies are coming and using it. Then...
That's exactly my point, though.
Yes.
What you just described is a Class 2 well,
Yes.
not a Class 1 well.
Now, if the injection well, if it is for per operator, or let's say you've got 5 sites out there you're drilling on, but you're using one injection well for those 5 sites, then that's a little more controlled than if it's just open to everywhere that's out there.
Exactly. Now, that's what I was trying to say. You were not concerned about medical waste or any
Well,
other weird kind of waste.
Yeah,
What you were talking about was,
thing.
right, and that's a
as
different,
Rick has pointed out.
It's
you
a
know, the eyes of
different
the EPA, that's a
permit.
totally different.
yes, it's different permit and
Yeah,
everything.
for-
It's a whole nother class.
And that's not going to sneak in under the guise of oil exploration.
We're
That's gonna-
working on oil and gas.
Yeah,
right now.
exactly.
So what I'm saying is, specific to oil and gas, there are basically 2 types of wells, and from what I got from the committee, the biggest concern was for these wells that allow oil and gas waste, E&P waste, to come in from wherever.
Yeah, I think
And those, my terminology, I call them disposal wells, but you can call them anything you want, I don't care. But anyway, that's one group of wells, and my understanding was that was the group that we wanted to be a major, so that everybody could eye it a little more closely. And then all the other wells, whether they're new, whether they're repurposed, whatever, they're specific to extraction of oil and gas. And those would be a minor with a administrative process connected to an MOU. And the reason behind that was that, all of those wells are looked at more closely than actual oil and gas wells because they come under the Safe Drinking Water Act.
I still don't understand I understand that an injection well or a disposal well should be a minor. I have no problem with that because that's the drilling and completion of those wells are almost identical to that of drilling an oil and gas well in the first place.
And it's specific to the extraction of oil and gas.
Well, but yes.
And it's typically associated with one operator.
No.
Possible it could be more than
See,
one
that's-
operator.
That's
Well, first off, I think that we have to, and I think that Rick hit it on the head. If we're talking a class 1 disposal well, the eyes of the EPA, that's a
and we're not.
bring it up.
We're not.
No,
We're not.
but we keep in our conversations here. We keep saying injection and disposal wells in the same breath, talking about the same type of wells. So we have to define it in our own documentation here, so that we don't have that.
The EPA calls them enhanced recovery wells and disposal wells.
Now, if the
That's how they
if the
classify it.
bad
And that's the way they
baddies
issue
are
the first
class
The
1
disposal
EPA
wells.
and the not so baddies having to do with oil and gas
I'm
exploration.
sorry if I misled you. There's 6 classes of wells. Okay. There are other types of wells that include things like burying radioactive waste in the bottom.
Okay.
Okay. The ones that we're concerned, and we're not concerned with that at all. Okay, we're concerned about class 2 wells, which is all about oil and gas.
Right.
So I don't want to make you think that there are only class 1 and we'd probably be
But we have a
okay.
description of what those different classes are.
Absolutely. And
So
it's well defined, and you're right. A good definition in the document would be well
Did you
defined.
look, you pay mention this, but this basically says, this is off the EPA's website, what are the types of class 2 wells?
Okay.
Okay, and class 2, what is a class 2 well? Class 2 well has to do with oil and natural gas production. Period. All
And
class 2
then
wells. But then there's a
extrapolating
subcategory.
on if we
Right.
use the
Then there's
EPA
a
definition of what these wells are.
That's what I'm saying.
And
If you look at the
extrapolating
subtext of that,
Let me get this all
okay?
still fresh. I haven't in a long day. Well, if we, using EPA terminology, so there is no confusion between, because when we're talking injection or disposal, as you've been talking, you're talking about sinking a well, basically. And at
The
least.
mechanics of it are very similar.
Yes,
That's what you're
exactly,
saying.
exactly. So not everybody understands the difference of what's going on. So we need something in our regulations and in all of our documentation that makes it clear that when we say this is exactly what we're meaning. And then when we want to decide whether this is a minor or a major, I think it should be tied to basically how much is going in it and how many people are involved in it.
Well, that's why I went to the EPA, so we could use the terminology that they use because the EPA has jurisdiction, even though in Colorado it's done by COGC, too many acronyms.
Yes, well, we know.
COGCC. I thought that probably the best way is to use their terminology since it's their
Makes sense.
jurisdiction.
As long as we have something that everybody knows, whether it's us
Well,
or
I
them
think-
or anybody looking at it, what we're talking about.
The proposal here to make these disposal wells a major facility.
Exactly.
Okay.
And these
A
minor with an administrative process available
To the, right.
through
Well,
an
like any other.
Right.
So Carolyn, if I may, just a comment.
Oh,
So
yeah,
those-
right here, yeah.
So there's two definitions in the EPA. So you have your disposal well, which is not an enhanced recovery well. It's where you're putting water into a zone that you're not currently producing from. It's an EPA definition of disposal, which is what you just said, you're considering making that a major. Even if it's my only disposal well and I'm going into the DJ sands, but I'm producing out of the Marmaton, technically by the EPA, that's a disposal well. I have no intent to improve my oil production. The other one is an injection well where you're injecting into a reservoir in which you're actively extracting oil. So I could still be a little guy that's producing some oil and water with my oil production, and I have a depleted interval that's used to have oil in it, but there's no current active oil exploration or production from that interval. If I'm disposing in that zone, which I'd like to do, there's already a wellbore in it. According to the EPA, that is a disposal well, not a enhanced injection well. So yet,
That isn't the way that they describe it, though.
I think it
Sure
is.
it is.
I think it is.
And what he's saying is he's not using it for enhanced production. He's putting his
I'm just getting rid of waste into a zone with no intent to improve production.
No, I think
It's a disposal.
So let me just comment here. I
Okay.
did take a shot at some language in the appendix to that draft. Don't worry about the MOU part. But it's conflicting with what we're trying to arrive at here. I thought rather than try and worry about, number one, the definitions and some of the issues with disposal wells, or whether you want to use it to enhance a well, I'd rather concentrate on the quality of the water at all times, so that we can control the water quality, and the operator can use it pretty much as he sees fit for either enhanced recovery or disposal.
No,
If
no.
he meets the requirement for the water that he's
But you can't do, the reason why you're disposing of the water is the water is trapped.
It's poison.
Well, it's poison, right, and that's the problem that.
No, it's salty.
It's salty, it's got solids or whatever. Yeah.
Well,
It-
you don't want to blow it
But
around.
the reason you have a disposal well is to get rid of water that isn't potable water.
I just have a question here. We're talking about making one major, and maybe this is getting back to what you're saying. I'm a little.
I'm confused as heck of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, well, here's my.
So am I, which is why we came back.
Here's the source of my confusion. And I think this is what you were saying. They're both wells, right? Well, you know, they just have different purposes. But the process, you're drilling, you got stuff out there, and you're drilling, and you're trying to do different things. But the process is similar, right? In terms of-
The drilling and the completion
And the
equipment
equipment.
and the safety things that you take into consideration.
So
are
why would you
similar.
read one as a major and one as a minor?
Well, that's what I've been trying to get somebody to tell me.
And I don't know whether they should, which should be which.
I think a water injection well certainly should be a minor because you're going through the same zone, you're open holes in the pipe, and you're pumping water up. The question about it is the disposal part of this, because there you're using water that has no other purpose except it needs to be gotten rid of. And like John said, it's probably because of the salinity or the dissolved solids or something like that. Usually it goes into either an old abandoned zone, or it may go into a different zone where the water quality of the natural quality of the water in that zone is poorer than what you're injecting. So coming back to the issue here, if it's just a standard injection well, it should be a minor. If it's just a standard disposal well to be used by the operator, it should be a minor. The only question in my mind becomes is when we have the centralized facility that had a whole bunch of stuff with it, including a commercial water disposal well.
That is exactly what we're trying to arrive at, and I think it's a matter of semantics, because when you say a disposal well for an oil well, I'm seeing that as being related to extraction. In other words, an operator is operating that injection well, and it's related to their own wells, as opposed to a disposal well that is nothing but a commercial venture. They don't have a well. They just come out, they dig a hole in the ground, and they take waste from any operator, and
take oil and gas waste, yes.
Right, and that's the oil and gas waste, and those are the ones that seem to be of concern.
Now, let's talk about this for a minute. Because if we make the disposal wells operator specific, Southwestern can only have their own wells, ConocoPhillips can only have their own wells, Schwartzy Oil Company can only have their own disposal wells, we're going to have more disposal wells in the county than are reasonable. So the idea that, I'm not saying this very well, the idea that there should be a commercial facility gathering up water from oil and gas operations to be either recycled or disposed of should be something we would encourage, because then you get a centralized facility and you have an opportunity to have facilities of sufficient size that pipelines and those kind of things are there. I've always assumed, and I guess I thought from our last meeting where we were at, and maybe I was naive, I thought if we had a centralized commercial treatment, recycling, and disposal facility, it's a major. If it was a normal disposal well that was under the rules of the state and the EPA, or an injection well, and the injection, if you put these things in a category of opportunities for things to go wrong, the injection well is very little opportunity for things to go wrong, because basically you're injecting fresh water or near fresh water. A disposal well by an operator, he's going to be taking care of that in a very real sense. The only reason why the commercial recycling and centralized facility should be a major is just because of size.
Just as a footnote there, the language we had last time was any conversion of an existing well into one of those centralized facilities requires a new application. So if there's one that's already out there and someone wants to convert it, that then requires a new
Right, and that's
application.
in here. And I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other. You know me, I actually am pro these wells because I think they take trucks off the road. But my understanding, mostly with you, Paul, was that you were really not happy with these commercial operations being the minor. So that's what we were trying to arrive
So,
at.
Jerry, we've already got it in here.
Can I suggest some language that Texas has a few wells down there, and they also have the same issue, right? So what they do is they focus on the purpose, and I heard this several times, but so if the intent of the injection well is commercial, i.e. to make money, then it requires a major. So it doesn't matter if I'm Swin Oil and Gas and I choose to get in water disposal business, it's a major permit. I've got to explain what I'm going to do, etc. If I am disposing of saltwater brine from my oil and gas activities in a well that is permitted with the state, that's a minor and it's part of what I do every day. And here's the one gray area. Some states don't allow me to dispose of anybody else's water but my own. Well, it's kind of a shame if Conoco drills right next to me and he's half mile away. So if I don't charge him and we come to an agreement, that is a non-commercial and I can accept his water. But think about this. I spent a lot of money to drill that injection well. I really don't want to take very much of his water. But if he only has one or two wells, I might agree to do that as a good neighbor. But I can't charge him. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's a commercial facility and I've got to get a special permit. So it's about the intent of the use, or not the intent, the actual use. If it's for disposal of oil and gas waste produced by the operator or received by another operator without charge, I can't take the commercial benefit, then it should be a minor.
So what I'd like to do is return to where we were and go back to the B where we said basically that any major, leave that as a major, any central treatment, recycling, water disposal facility, and associated pipelines. So that, to me, if we wanted to insert a commercial operation in there,
I have a language, it says, if the actual use of the injection well is commercial disposal of produced water, then it is a major oil and gas facility.
Okay, so in our minor oil and gas facility, we don't have any language in here. The language that you just read, I remember that, but I don't see it in here.
I've got it right here too.
Can I make?
Oh, I see, number 4, recompletion of the graphic. We don't have, I'm sorry.
Well,
my thought, please. We don't have any reference to injection wells of any kind in minor. So do we want to add some language here as to what types of wells that we will consider minor? That makes
Yes,
sense?
yes, and I would like to suggest. Pardon me, sir? Well,
No, type 2 that won't work because type 2 includes both. Both
But I
types.
was-
I know it's confusing. It's confusing.
Any localized, in the, to take into the neighbor thing, localized water disposal well or conversion of an existing well.
Well, we've got that one under a separate, your language of item number 4, recompletion, refracturing.
No, that has nothing to do. That, well, I guess it could. I would never. That's not the same.
I have a question here. If I might, about decentralized facilities. I mean, I understand this commercial.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one way to approach it. What I wonder is, I mean, the reason we want to treat these, as I understand it, the reason for treating these centralized facilities as a major facility is that they're standalone.
And they're big.
They're big, and they're dealing with material for multiple tasks. Right? Now, certainly, one group of those would be the kind of commercial operation that John describes. But could you also have one that might be and maybe you can answer this for me, where you might have an operator with a bunch of producing facilities scattered around the county that would decide to have a centralized facility off-site?
That would happen in almost all cases. What an operator that may have 15 wells in an area,
Right.
every one of those wells will produce some water.
Right.
And so you don't want 15 disposal wells.
Right.
He'll convert one well to water disposal for his operations.
One well on a pre-existing pad.
It might be a new well or it might be a pre-existing well. It'll depend.
Well, will that facility look like the kind of commercial facility we're talking about?
It would be unlikely it would be nearly as large.
No. Did you go with us when we interviewed?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so you remember that huge facility that we
Uh-huh.
saw? That's what we were talking about. We were talking about a recycling facility. Those giant tanks and the lights, the bays with the lights and all of it. That's a huge.
All I'm getting at is I want to make sure this idea of a commercial facility encompasses all the
It's a
possible
lot of
permutations.
Let me tell you what a water disposal well looks like. There'll be probably 2 tanks there and a pump. And maybe a free water knockout, just to make sure that you don't, because you don't want to re-inject any of your petroleum product because it causes emulsions and it's a bad thing to do. So most of the time what they'll have is either a big tank where there'll be time for the water and the oil to settle in there, the oil will come to the top. And sometimes there'll be a little bit of heat, but not usually as, but it's the free water, it's a system of weirs and things like that. Free water knockout, they have to make sure it gets the last tidbits of oil, because usually what happens when you treat oil at a production facility, there's usually about 0.5% or so of oil that remains in the water as an emulsion, and that's the reason why at these facilities they'll have something. And then there'll be a second tank where that water will go off that tank into the second tank, and from there it'll be pumped into the ground. That's it. Is that about right?
Now remember too, say you have a bigger field, say you have 100 wells, but even though there's an administrative process, we have to submit the equipment we're putting on every location. So it's
when
not
we get
like...
to 100 wells, we're going to have to revisit that.
Okay, fair enough. But what I'm saying
There's
is...
no error on that.
There's no
and by
way...
then we'll have hired someone to do it.
I'm sure you guys still be enough revenues they can afford to do so. But my point is, we, as an operator, even though it's a minor, we can't go out there and build 50,000 barrel tanks without submitting that to the county for approval. So there's nothing will be done under the table, even if it's a minor.
Well, it's not a question of being under the table. It's just the difference between major and minor is, at least a minor where there's an MOU, is that with a major you have this, big public process, which, if you're talking about a really large disposal facility, people are going to want to have.
I like the concept of commercial and non-commercial as your separation. That makes more sense than anything else. Keeps it simple. and also discourage, because obviously if you have a disposal well and that's what you drilled it for, it's going to be a commercial venture. So there you go. And so all the other bad things, all the other wells from class 1 on up, I guess EPA works backwards, so class 1 is the most scariest one. But they would be a commercial venture, so it's taken care of. So the small operation you're talking about, non-commercial, it's within a minor. If it becomes commercial, it's a major. If you have to come back with facilities so large to handle the 50 wells you have out here or whatever, it becomes a major anyway. It's a simple fact of the scope of the equipment involved. I think it takes care of itself.
Okay, so it sounds like everybody's kind of in agreement on what the split should be. Should we go over and actually write language here?
Well, the only question is
I mean, Rick has some language for the major. Should we write some language for the minor?
Well, what you could say, in the minor is any treatment, recycling, or water disposal facility not covered by, subsection 2B, the major reg. So in other words, anything that's not that, which is going to be defined as a commercial facility, is going to be a minor.
Okay, but the one
Do
thing.
you really want to say that? Do you want to be able to exercise some discretion if there's a gray area to go ahead and make the call? Because I think some of that discretion lies with the planning department to be able to say this is going to be a major. Instead of putting language into a minor that says if we haven't already talked about it, like some new technology we haven't thought about, we might want to exercise, we might want to put that in the language in there so that someone can use that and say therefore it must be a minor.
Well, you can add a proviso to it. That's a good point. You can add a proviso to it. It says something, provided, however, that if,
we can simplify this right down. Is under the minor we put any field injection or disposal well would be a
But
minor.
that doesn't address what Rick just said.
Yeah, it does. And then we go to the major, where we have any centralized, we can insert the word commercial in there, and then we'll take
But he's talking about adding some discretion for the planning department.
Discretion over there. There's no other language required. I'm just saying that I like that language. Any field injection or disposal well, something that's defined by EPA and not included in paragraph B here, is a minor.
Okay.
Well, as a concerned citizen,
where's the
Yeah.
Why not just put it under the minor oil and gas facility? And it's written down as one of the items.
Yeah.
So he suggests go under A.
Just put in like the non-commercial.
Yeah, it's not commercial in the minor because if you don't, it just make a proviso there that all commercial will be a major.
Yeah, but in the minor specify.
Yeah, that way you don't have one and two disposal.
Yeah, you don't want the word, you want to limit it to scope for the minor. And the best way to do that is to limit it to a field. And so, because even though there's going to be huge study development in Niagara, a field is usually a localized area that an operator defines with oil and gas industry.
Not spacing.
No, it could be on multiple levels.
Because that's what we're trying to get.
Well, actually, there is language in there that the director at his discretion can elevate a minor to major. So the language, if I'm understanding correctly, and we'll get to just a second, Rick, any non-commercial field injection or disposal well that does not meet, and obviously I'll have to clean up this language, 2B is considered a minor. Is that cover everything?
So it will be covered by an MOU in that case, or the MOU.
Well, if it's a minor, it's got to have an MOU.
Well, they can do a minor as a regular special use if they want.
Yeah, they can go to special use. Right.
Everybody's agreed on that one. Okay, then Rick, you've got some language. Do you want to do that to me now, or do you want to email that to me for the major?
Email it, and we have it recorded on video, so.
Okay.
Very good.
so my concern is about truck traffic. We got to live with the truck traffic. And I would like to have some input if I'm going to have a disposal well in my neighborhood where trucks are coming from 100 wells all around, as Mr. Campbell said. I'd like to know about that.
Well,
And I think the citizens ought to have a chance to give input as to
Well,
whether they
Well,
want.
that's our
Hang on a
definition.
second.
You would.
Hang on a second.
But in a
Hang on a
minor,
second, Rick. Even
Sorry.
if it's a minor, I know where you're going with this.
okay, thanks.
Okay, because we can talk about this
Okay.
last meeting. And even if it's a minor, they still have to do notification. And we are going to expand it to a full mile of notification. There you go, that's why I asked for that. Remember we talked about that? remember?
Good.
And you said that's fine.
And they have still have that traffic impact analysis and the road maintenance agreement and all of that.
But as a road maintenance agreement, the rest, it depends on what it is.
I think traffic, that's the sound.
Well, sometimes it has to have a traffic memo, it depends on, I mean, if he's right off a paved road, probably inertia is gonna say, I'm okay with the traffic letter. If he's gonna travel 10 miles down dirt roads, then yeah, you're probably gonna.
I think the point that you made here that I think is a very important one, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are issues regarding a major oil and gas facility going into an area that should not be given short shrift. They
Yes.
don't have to do with produced water, they have to do with truck traffic, inherent safety issues, emergency services and so forth, and I'm not sure that we give those the credit that they deserve.
Well, in a major, they would have to submit that. In any major, they would have to submit a traffic study because in a major, the traffic impacts are exponentially larger. I mean, there's no comparison between the traffic impacts of an individual well pad and a major. So that's true. We were talking about a minor. And in a minor, what they would be required. Well, they have to address traffic, but the way they have to address it could vary, depending on what it is. And actually, that's true of everything.
Well, the complexity of the traffic.
Right,
impact
in land use, it's that way too. If they're coming, if they've got a driveway off a paved road, right, then we're gonna wanna know, we're gonna want to write a letter that's gonna tell us, well, how many trucks are gonna come through at what time of day and stuff like that. Okay, and a letter is probably gonna do what they call it phase one. If it's a full-blown, large facility, or it's going down 10 miles of dirt road or crazy where there's school bus routes or whatever, they're gonna want a full-blown traffic study. So it kind of depends, and we depend, rather than trying to regulate that so we don't again end up with a 64-page document, we tend to leave that in the regs as requested by engineering. Engineering will know what to ask for, what's appropriate for the particular proposal. We can possibly write a regs to cover everything.
Or,
Does that answer the question? Okay.
so what's next?
All right, so we got injection wells. So the next one we're going to go to is we're going to go to
That's mitigation.
that's mitigation on page 13, I think.
Can I make a comment with regard to
Certainly.
the definition between a commercial and a non-commercial disposal well? John suggested there that it should be, that the operator should be allowed to take water from adjacent operators. And that's not necessarily how I understand the industry currently works. Because otherwise, why would there ever be a commercial Class 2 UIC injection?
Oh, to make money?
Of course.
No, in a full-scale development, I can see a Halliburton or some other service company that says, hey, I'll take your water, and I'm going to go through the full phase, the big, we forgot the names, the majors, right? And they may be permitted, and we would then take water to them or run a pipeline to them and pay them to dispose.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a commercial facility.
Well, are you suggesting that under the non-commercial facility you would still be maintaining the records and the same kind of thing that you would as a commercial facility?
I didn't say anything about records, but yes, we do keep records on every barrel we dispose in injection well we submit to the state. So there's, even though it's a non-commercial facility, there's absolutely records of pressure, casing integrity, tubing pressure, annulus pressure, monthly inspections,
But are you
and volumes and rates.
So you're going to be keeping records of your competitors' well disposal rates, exactly which leasehold it comes from, which well it comes from, how much, and which formation it's going into. Because as a commercial operator, that's what you would be expected to do. And as a non-commercial operator, taking water from a competitive company for nothing really doesn't fit into the definition to me as a non-commercial operation. Because there's still going to be some benefit to the operator that's not paying for his disposal.
Yeah, that's why we wouldn't do it very often.
Well,
will you do it at all?
Maybe. I could see a situation where, well, I'm thinking the shoe's on the other foot. I'm out there in far.
Oh, you're hoping to not have to pay for your disposal.
And my friend JD has a disposal well already permitted, and I produce 100 barrels of salt water every 6 months. And his disposal well is a half-mile away. It would be nice if I could truck it over to him and say, hey, this is salt water produced from this zone, and he's going to check it. He's not going to want to put anything bad or muddy in his well. It would be nice if that was available.
And he's going to keep track of his 100 barrels and report that to the state.
I understand.
And I have to tell the state where it went. So I'm going to have to tell the state it went to JD number 2.
So to answer Dave's question, do we want to say if you're going to be sharing that well, it needs to be reported to the county?
Well, it has to be reported to the EPA anyway.
Do we care as a county?
And as a county, it would have to be something that we would know about. But what I was going to say, which actually had nothing to do with that, was just sort of give a little history to some of the people who are here that don't know this. The reason this even came up is because we've actually been approached about a straight disposal well. No oil and gas associated. They don't do oil and gas. All they do is water disposal. And when we asked them, well, where is the water going to come from? They said it can come from anywhere. The closest one's in Fort Collins. So that's why my mind kept going to in connection with extraction, is because these guys don't extract anything. That's not their business. They just accept the produced water. They have these big tanks that there's actually still hydrocarbons in it, and they pull it out into a different separate tank, and they sell that. That's part of their business too, but they don't extract anything. And then the water, if they can, they will recycle it, and oil and gas companies like that because it's cheaper for them to use the recycled water. And then when it can't be recycled anymore, or in the case of Elbert County for the next few years, we won't have a facility probably like that. And they won't have another well to take it to. I mean, recycling is wonderful, but you have to have somewhere to take it, right? Well, at first, if you only got one well or 3 wells or something, you probably don't have another well to take it to. It's got to go somewhere. So your choices are either injecting it or trucking it. That's pretty much the only choices.
You know, Carolyn, let me interject one thing here.
I'm just in history. I'm not just an opinion or anything.
But I think the underlying thing here is that if I put my public hat on, I say, well, it'd be nice if we had regulations that covered everything that could ever happen, and it doesn't. And no regulations do. However, we do have the option in the future to change our regulations. So if we haven't caught all the things that happen, we can morph into what we need to be. Right now, we're just trying to get something. And if we keep having small squabbles amongst ourselves about small technicalities or wordings or whether John wants to be neighborly with JD or not. So it just stalls the process, and we have to get through this. We have to get this done.
One thing
we have something to go.
One thing I've learned over the last 2 years is if we don't have things in place before it happens, it's too late, Paul.
Well, one thing we know from years and years and years of being on the planning commission is you can never have everything in place. Because when you think you do, something new comes around the corner. So you have to be adaptable to go with it.
You can't write
But you
regulations.
have to have a basis to start with, and that's what we're trying to get to now.
Then tell me what the basis is. John, maybe you can answer this. If you want to dispose of your effluent, what does the permit from the state require, and how do you know what you're disposing of? What does the state require you to report?
I don't have a well. That was going to be my point, though. Not only do you have to come here to get permission to convert a well, you have to go to the state of Colorado.
Yeah.
No, but we can answer this question. What you have to do, you report to the state. Is the source of the water, where it come from, how it got there, how much volume, where it was disposed of, at what pressure, and of what volume. And then you had, at least when I used to do this, you had to submit records, I can't remember, was it twice a year or once a year, that showed that you had your pressure integrity test for all annular spaces, the surface casing, the the long string, and the annular space between your packer and your tubing. Is that not right?
Yes.
And also, do you have a fail-safe there that if they have a pressure differential that changes between any one of those annular spaces, the well automatically shuts down?
And are those wells
Or the pump
deeper,
shuts down.
are those wells deeper than our aquifers at all times or not?
Oh, absolutely.
Or they were-
Absolutely.
So there's two requirements, but you don't have to check the quality of what you're injecting. Is that a statement?
You don't, I don't believe the state requires you do a water analysis and submit it. But we do water analysis all the time on our produced water that we produce with the oil and gas. And the only thing that we do between producing it from the ground and putting the water back in the ground is gravity segregation, or maybe heat in the winter. Sometimes we heat that to break the emulsion. But basically we get the water as clean of the oil as possible, and then we inject it. So or dispose of it. So there is no chemical process. You're not changing. It's water that came out of the ground with the oil mixed. We separate the two, we sell the oil, and we dispose of the water, or recycle in a development scenario. That would be a great thing.
And if you don't check for radioactivity, you don't check for heavy metals, you don't check for other toxic materials that could be injected into the well at the same time.
But you have to remember that the whole point of these injection wells is for that garbage, that terrible stuff. And that's why they make these injection wells so deep. They're already going into terrible
So unless the
water.
casing fails, there's no problem. But if the casing fails, there could be a problem.
Well, there's multiple, it's not just the casing, right? You have tubing and at least 2 strings of casing. So you have 3 strings of pipe and 2 annuluses that are cemented.
In a packer down hole so that the water doesn't come up. The water stays down there.
Usually.
To address Patty's comment, which is the only one actually that
That's what the testing
has
is.
caught my attention real strongly, maybe what we need to do is in the case of a minor, stipulate that you have to either tell us at the time of the permit if you intend to allow other operators,
I think that's fair.
or you have to come back and get approval from us, not necessarily a new permit, but get approval from us to allow another operator, so that at least the county can track it.
You're aware
If
of it.
we have a problem, we can track it. We know whose waste went into that well if we end up having a problem with that well. Is that fair?
Sure. We'd be glad to give you our monthly injection, water disposal and water injection.
Oh, yay, thank you.
We'll give you all the data that we already give the state. We'd be glad to copy the county.
Now,
Okay,
John
let's
said
do
something
that.
that is pretty important, as that they try and clean that water up as clean as they can before they inject it, and that's in their own self-interest.
Yes.
Because if they put garbage down the well, by that I mean solids, or oil which emulsifies when it goes in, or if they inject bacteria into the well, what happens is you create a mess down hole. And you've got to remember what you're pumping that water in is something that looks like a cinder block. It's solid, but there's little pores in it, and you're filling up those pore spaces. But those pore spaces act as a filter. So if you pump something in there that's not clean, what it does is it builds up on the surface of the formation, and it makes it so they have to inject at ever-increasing pressures, or they can't inject at all. So one of the things you got to understand is that your concern is a good question. On the other side of the coin, these guys want to act in their self-interest too by putting in as clean of water as they can.
They don't live here.
Or they'll just acid frack it every
It's at
month.
7,000 feet. I mean, it's down there.
All right,
Say, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Or the operator will regularly acid frack that well, so as they disperse the crap that they put in the hole, so as it travels further. There's no restriction in my experience of what can go down a Class 2 acid injection well, so long as it doesn't fall outside of that EMP waste definition. So anything can go down, and invariably...
As long as it's EMP waste.
So long as it's EMP
Which is
waste
saltwater.
only, it's tied specifically.
Saltwater, heavy metals, radioactive material.
The point is to inject the water, and if we put crap down there and can't inject the water, then we've defeated the purpose.
So they'll chuck a load of acid
I don't
down
do
there
that.
to let it disperse, and then they'll start
Put
operating.
pictures up here.
Okay, but I guess my question with this is I'm not arguing any of that, but the water has to go somewhere. Has to go someplace. So,
Don't
you know,
disagree.
truck it to another facility, I guess, but,
Don't
or
disagree.
someplace.
There are rules, there are state rules to, for guidance on EMP waste.
Right, and they have to follow them. They have to follow them. I mean, that's the thing about the injection wells. I mean, I'm kind of on the side of injection wells, which is not usually very nice. And the reason is because, to me, heck, they're more heavily monitored and regulated than the oil and gas well to begin with. I mean, the oil and gas well is exempted from the Clean Water Act. E&P waste disposal wells are not. They are covered by the State Drinking Water Act. They are regulated by the EPA. Oil and gas wells are not. That's all being given over to the state. So to me, I mean, if you're looking at the two, that one feels safer than the other. And you don't have to truck it. Now, I know Paul doesn't agree with me. He has a lot of trucking background, so we'll agree to disagree.
Okay, is there an alternative to just pumping that water down?
Pre-treatment.
Pre-treatment, which fundamentally says you know what you're putting down the hole.
Not necessarily, because if you pre-treat it, how deep, how far do you pre-treat it? I mean, you can pre-treat it to the point where it's drinking water again.
And what do
If
you
don't
do with
have
the
enough
solids?
equipment there.
You still got to get rid of because what you're doing is you're just concentrating the remainder. Is that you can boil it off or desalinate it or do all of those kind of things, but what you're doing is you're just compressing the volumes, but making the stuff, we'll just use the
More
word stuff,
toxic.
but more concentrated.
More toxic.
Then you end up with solids, and then what the heck are you going to do with the solids?
That's exactly right.
And actually, if I remember correctly from your conversation with your friend, that's kind of what recycling does until it gets it to the point where it's...
What they like to do is they like to use the water till it gets so concentrated that you can't dilute it, you can't treat it, and it has to be gone rid of.
They get rid of it generally via injection
Disposal wells.
wells, right?
Yes.
Or disposal wells.
That's the water has to go somewhere. You said the right word. It has to go somewhere. It either has to be trucked to somebody else's yard, or it has to be piped somewhere. But in the end, the same thing happens to it, no matter where it goes. It gets injected in the ground. So I think we beat this one to death. Can we go on to the next subject?
But I mean, we have an open meeting
Oh, I
because
understand.
we want to hear what people have to
I
say.
appreciate you listening, thank you.
So the next thing that we were going to talk about was the dust control measures. We kind of did it 180 degrees last meeting, and that's what we really meant to do. I guess that's okay. But I had a couple of phone calls that people maybe were reconsidering their position on this. I will tell you, I'll start it. I'll tell you that I'm not in favor of this. I wasn't before. For a number of reasons of using produced water for dust mitigation for a number of reasons. Most of them, or the most important one, is a very selfish one. I think the public will probably slip my tires and lynch me at some point because it's so visible. The other reason is that I have a much higher comfort level with this stuff 7,000 feet under the ground and sprayed on the roads. And another consideration that someone gave me is that while the water, even if we could test it adequately, which I think is questionable. I mean, we always have to remember resources in this county are extremely limited. Even if we could test it and it met the 35,000, 3,500, I'm sorry, the water evaporates.
Total dissolved solid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The water evaporates, and the total dissolved solids are still there. And then they come through and they spray again,
Yeah.
and the water evaporates.
Also,
And the total dissolved solids are still there.
And that becomes your dust that we're all going to
And
breathe.
then, and we've not, in this county has not met its dust mitigation targets ever.
No.
So we all know how bad the dust is. It's bad enough we got the dust, but I don't like the idea of it. So that's That's my input. Let's see what everybody else.
Are you suggesting that we ban the use of
Well, before
water
the
for
last
dust
meeting,
mitigation?
what we had in our regulations was that we didn't allow it.
Right.
And I was comfortable
You're
with that.
suggesting we go back to that.
Right. But, like I said, I would go.
Very good point. That is, what is the language that we have right now? Okay, let me read it to you. It says, the facility operator will be responsible for mitigating dust during all phases of operational activity and shall submit a plan for county approval to accomplish dust mitigation to include water quality testing at owner's expense. So that's what we talked about last time. That's a starting point.
Is that what we started talking about at the last meeting, or is that what's in the?
What it said
That's
previous
where
to
we
the
are.
last meeting was very simple. It said the facility operator will be responsible for mitigating dust during all phases of operational activity. Produced water cannot be used for dust mitigation on the site or on the roadways. That was it. That was all we had for dust mitigation.
And then after that discussion, we go back to language.
I prefer that language significantly because it eliminates a lot of problems. The disposal well has been accepted. There is a method to get rid of the water that it has to get rid of, and we don't induce any problems because not only is it the fact that the solids are there, we have the radiation issue, which is another can of worms here that needs testing, and that's also a residue that ends up on the roads. So I'm all in favor of not allowing any of the water for dust mitigation.
One of the reasons that I passed out a stratigraphic section, which you should have in front of me, which describes where the geology is here in Colorado.
Which sheet is
There are
that?
two sources.
Can you show us which
That's
sheet
that
it
one
is?
right there.
This one? Okay.
That looks like that. So, if I can just go like
Sure.
one of the things that you have here is all the rocks underneath us, and right at the very top are the aquifers. What you see is in the middle there is a Niobrara. That's the production formation, and I just encourage you to flip that over on the backside, and it shows where the oil and gas is actually being produced from. It's from some chalk formations in the Niobrara, referred to as the Codell-Niobrara interval. Okay, there are two sources of uranium and vanadium in Colorado. The first one is a formation called the Laramie Fox Hills, up by Wellington, where they have this crazy notion of injecting acid into the soil and dissolving it and sucking it back up and getting the uranium and vanadium out from there. It's a very specific geological environment that produces the laydown of uranium and vanadium. It's very specific, and it's not terribly dissimilar from the one that produces gold in riverbanks and river beds. The other one is much, much deeper. It's in the Morrison. It's the richest source of uranium and vanadium in Colorado. 16,000 tons were produced from Morrison, Colorado, up on the other side of Denver. And that's the other place in Colorado, the other formation in Colorado that produces uranium and vanadium. Now, uranium and vanadium, those elements, are pretty widespread. And one of the products that you get in the degradation from uranium eventually to something called lead is something called radon. So if you have radon, you're looking at a byproduct of that journey from radioactive uranium to lead. So to talk about the presence of uranium and vanadium in and of itself needs to be constrained a little bit. Where are the primary sources? And those are both in rock formations that in the case of Morrison are far deeper than the Niobrara. Okay, and the oil wells never get there. So any produced water coming out of that is not going to be source uranium and vanadium coming from the Morrison, or it's a formation that has gone straight through, which is the Laramie Fox Hills, some 7,000 feet higher from the production formation. So it's uranium, radioactivity, I should say, is far more common than we might like to think. We all have perhaps radon to some degree in our environment, and that tells us that there's another process going on there. So radioactivity in and of itself is not necessarily a cause for great alarm. Somehow there has to be quantitative measures put on that, because here clearly the EPA has what are called MCLs, or minimum levels for radioactivity, like uranium and vanadium, thorium and strontium and other elements like that. So if water that was of perhaps some suspect nature, you don't know, which is not the same thing as suspect, but you don't know the amount of radioactivity that might be in produced water. A one-time testing will tell you what the water coming out of that formation is going to look like. And I'm kind of jumping ahead here to something I know that Tony wants to talk about, but that is, there is a new requirement that was just put out by the CODCC in January, and I put that on the table too, and it has a list of all the testing that's done under CODCC Rule 609. That's the most stringent water quality standard in the nation. Okay? There are 2 other states that have water quality standards, and this one is head and shoulders above either of those 2 other states, Ohio and New York, I believe. If you're going to do water quality testing being done anyway, and there's a regularized test and a regularized process and independent labs that are producing jobs testing water for the purpose, at least once in that entire the life of the well, which 609 requires testing during the life of the well, beforehand, after the well is produced or actually started up, and then after the well is shut down. At least once, test the produced water. See what's in it. And then you know. There's no requirement to test it over and over again because it's not going to change. But you know if you tested it once. And that's one of the things that we might want to think about in this process. It's not an extraordinary burden on the oil and gas company. If they're already testing locally for water quality, they can just go over and test, and I'm sure it's not that simple. They can test the water quality of produced water, and then the answer is well distributed. The results of that information should be available to the public online, and it should be available through the county website in some fashion, I would like to see. Because I think those questions are reasonable questions to ask that can be answered definitively with empirical data. And that, we can't ask for better than that.
And certainly raise county confidence too.
Okay, that's the detail that I tried to capture in this proposal, the requirements for testing. And I agree with Rick, if you've tested maybe even once per section, you probably have covered the radiation.
The CODCC will look like this if you have it in front of you.
But
what about dust mitigation?
well, all right. So for me, I like not using any of it for dust mitigation because you've got all these inherent potential hazards. They're not real yet. But no matter what you do, the residues of everything in that water ends up on the road.
I get it.
So we have a choice. You can either regulate it, like I tried to do here, or you eliminate it, and then you have to dispose of it, clean it up, process it, and get rid of it.
It makes sense to me. I mean, what I found sort of persuasive last time was this pitch about, listen, you preserve water. You don't
Right. Absolutely.
But, I mean, so, but on the other hand, the risks.
You have to
Why
decide,
is the risk?
you have to decide what that balance is.
Well, my thought process, because I was a proponent because of the water conservation issue.
Right.
And then after I got thinking about it a little bit, is that we don't have the muscle right now to make sure that everybody's playing nice. So why take the risk?
I
I mean, it sounds good, so it makes sense, as the water's coming up, and rather than use fresh water to do the same thing. Because, these guys are going to be putting something down on their haul roads and stuff within their operations, because the dust that trucks are going to kick up when we're in the middle of a hot summer is unbearable. So something's got to go down there. So if it's fresh water, it's just in one sense, it's our water anyway, it's coming out of our ground, it's going to be wasted. However, we don't have the muscle to control what's going on a day-by-day level at their operations, so we can't be 100% sure that the water going back onto the roads is not something in it.
Just to comment from one industry perspective, the limit of 3,500 ppm TDS, by the way, the reason that was of some interest to us is our first well happened to produce a lot of salt water. It's currently shut off, and it wasn't very bright. It wasn't very salty. So the opportunity to use that water, which we would definitely may consider using for fracking, was about 8,000 parts. So I could dilute it 1 to 3 and maybe use that. So I was kind of interested, but the odds are most produced water is going to be a lot saltier than that. So there's just not going to be a lot of water available at 3,500 or less. So it's really, it's not a deal killer.
Yeah, because
So I appreciate what you're saying, and I won't bring it up again.
Okay.
It's okay.
I
That's
did-
why we found you.
I did drive out. I did drive in from Agate though. I had a beautiful drive. Came out from your eastern side of the county this evening, and whatever the county is putting on the road, it is salt. Because it's all over the road. And it was coming off my tires like a powder. So
I have no
I think
idea.
the county's already putting some salt.
I have no idea what they're doing.
It's the perception of the other stuff. It's
I
it's not the brackish of the
I
water.
think the consensus is no produced water on the roads.
Does anybody else have comments they want to make about this? Would everybody agree that the consensus is we want to go back to the original language?
I think it's the safe bet at this point.
Yeah, I love consensus.
So you're happy once a night.
I'm happy once a month. Okay, so that was as far as we got last time.
And then we'll be.
And then we began to talk about pits. Yay! The interesting thing, one of the reasons I gave you Arapahoe's is because Arapahoe's MOU talks a lot about pits and in great detail.
It even talks about liners and rights for liners and all sorts of things.
And I thought that was interesting and might help us, see it the way someone else sees it. I know that John has some pretty strong feelings about that. If you want to talk to us a little bit about pits, I suppose that would be the thing.
Sure, I'll just say one or two things, and then if people have questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Pits on an exploratory well are not the issue. So we don't need a drilling pit to drill an exploratory well. I've got a well drilling in Arapahoe County. There's not a pit on location. Everything's above ground. When pits become really useful is when we're trying to recycle water during the development phase. It's actually for the fracking process. And we use the pits predominantly to store just fresh water. It's the water that we're preparing to use the frack. The problem is the frack occurs right after you drill the well. So it really can't be a separate permitting process. So often when we permit to drill the well, we tell the state we plan to drill a pit and we're going to use it for frack water, because when the rig leaves, within 3, 4, 5 days, we're out there scraping location, bringing in the frack equipment, and we frack the well. So it's not for drilling, even though we still call it a drilling pit, but it is used in the drilling and completion process. And I spent a lot of energy initially in Arapahoe County, didn't want any pits ever. And after some discussion and explanation, they came up with the MOU that industry's accepted for the most part, even though it's not finalized, but I think industry's okay with that. So that's why they're there. That's why they are useful.
Arapahoe MOU talks about a lot of different types of pits, not just fresh water.
Yeah, so the state has very specific pit rules, and I think there's 5, maybe there's 7. But there's 5 or 7, and some of them are production pits. So in the state of Colorado, you can still have a production pit, where instead of a tank separating the oil and gas, you can have a pit. Now they tell you how to build it, so it's very specific, but it's still in there. Most new operators would never use that. There's just no reason to risk putting oil purposely on a pit. So I know Southwestern Energy would never do that, even though it's allowed in the state. So when we started to discuss the pits in the MOU, they specifically talked about frack water pits or completion water pits, and I can't remember the terminology, because I did not want any. I said, if you want to ban a pit with oil and a weir, I got no problem, because that's not what we would ever build anyway. So that's why the MOU discusses multiple type of pits. We agreed to line them, even though the state of Colorado, you're not required to line a frack water pit. Lined with
fresh water.
Help me a little bit on this.
for fresh water, but we said, hey, we'll put a liner in.
Yeah, but just help me a minute or two here. Is that if you want to come up to my place and dig a bunch of pits and fill them full of fresh water, you're welcome to do that. The next question is,
Nobody brings cows to drink them.
what's that?
And nobody brings cows to drink them.
Oh yeah, and maybe you can put an irrigation pump in. The real question to me is, I'm indifferent about freshwater pits, is what is the life cycle of these pits? Do you use it for flowing back the frac water into them?
So it depends on the state. Every state is different. And in Arapahoe County, they're going to allow us to use it for flowback water, which is the same water you pumped in there, by the way.
Well,
So
it's
they're-
not, no, well, but.
Initially. Initially,
No, the chemical, I mean, when you say frac water, you mean the water with all the fracking chemicals in it, the proppants and the other stuff that goes in, or is it
It's-
just fresh water?
As well as anything natural that
Its
comes up.
flowback water has the.
flowback water has some surfactants and biocides and things that you add to it when you, yes, so it does have some things in it that we disclose, and you all know what they are probably by now. So that is, flowback water has some things in it. So Arapahoe County allows us to use that pit for flowback water, but it has to be lined, and there's very specific construction requirements. If you don't, Texas does, Arkansas does, the 3 states I'm familiar with the most, they all allow flowback water to go into a lined pit that is tested, and there's specific things about that. And the reason to do that is now we already have a pit that we use for fresh water, and these pits are maybe 100,000 barrels, so they handle all the water you need to do your horizontal frac. It flows back much slower, so it doesn't fill up immediately right after. Sometimes it takes 30 or 40 days, but now we have a place to put it so we can use it for the next well. It's about the recycling process. We can take that flowback water, because most of the chemicals, and yes, there's some chemicals in it, but we're talking about parts per million concentrations. So we take that same water and we can reuse it again and again and again. And that's why that pit is
So
used.
let me ask you a question. Is there some reason why that flowback water can't go back into the trucks and get reused? Is there some reason it has to go into a pit to get reused?
Great question, and the answer is time. So when we do a frac, we do it in 3 to 4 to 5 days. It's a very concentrated effort with a lot of equipment and energy, and we take that pond with 100,000 barrels, and it goes away in a couple of days, maybe even a day. When it flows back much slower. So to get that same volume, and sometimes we don't get all the frac water back. Sometimes you get 40 or 50% back. Depends if there's actual water. It's typical for shale gas. It's less typical for oil shales, where there's already liquids in that rock. The well we did in Adams County, we actually are producing water. So you don't know exactly if it's the same water you put in because it mixes with the natural salt water, but we've produced back way more than we put into it. It's also not an economic well. But, but for an example, we typically like to limit the rate the water comes back between 60 to 100 barrels per hour. So in a 24-hour period, on the high side, we're getting back 2,000 to 3,000 barrels of water. Well, we just put 100,000 barrels in it. So do the math, it would take a month to get it back. We can't really afford to have trucks out there for a month filling them back up with water.
I have 2 questions. Do you not, first of all, concerning the long period of time the pit's exposed with the flowback, everything's evaporating during that time, is that correct?
The freshwater would, that's all that matters.
And whatever hydrocarbons are evaporated. So that's part of the air quality that people are concerned about. Second of all, why are we talking trucks? Can't you not bring in the water via tanks and put it into tanks and sit there on the site until you're done fracking?
You can have some tank storage. There can be some tank storage.
Is it just a cost issue?
It would be a football field full of tanks.
Yeah, we've seen them up in Weld County.
Yeah. Well, the difference is that football field in Weld County, they're there for maybe 1 to 2 weeks while they're filling them up with fresh water. Then you empty them, then they go to the next well. So they have axles on them and they're mobile. And so you're there for 1 or 2 weeks versus 3, 6, 4, 9, 10 months, a year. You're going to have a pad full of tanks.
But you did use closed loop on that Adams County well, did you not?
We did not use a pit to frack the well.
Well, yeah, I have a question here, because the last time we all met, the COGG had just decided on their 500-foot setbacks, and one of the things they said, and then I haven't heard a thing about it since, anything within 1,000 foot of a residence had to be totally closed loop. So obviously the technology is there. How do you go about doing that? Can you explain that to us, to just kind of
Sure. But closed loop has nothing to do with fracking. So closed loop is a terminology for drilling. And we don't mind closed loop. We'll do closed loop. In any well we use oil-based mud, we do closed loop anyway.
Because the way the wording was released to the public was no pits. It just was like no pits, all closed loop. So there was no explanation of what portion of the process that would entail. It just was a definitive statement, no pits. So is that technology possible? All the way through the process.
The other part of it is that, these pits, the centralized pits, in that case, we're talking for fresh water, for fracking, those pits can be, utilized for multiple wells. So it does not have to be on the location of the wellhead. So in that case, it can be pumped to the spot in time to do the operation itself.
So if it's
in the
within
case
1,000 feet, it really technically doesn't have any pits near what's going on.
Right. The pit itself could be located outside that 1,000-foot radius, and then just with pipe to the location.
Okay.
We've pumped up to 10 miles away.
Okay.
Yeah, and currently ConocoPhillips, our operations in Arapahoe County, we've drilled a half dozen wells, and we've been able to pump from one pit to all of those locations. So for each well, we're saving 1,000 truck trips.
So what we have to do is focus in on what the consequences is that if the water has to be stored someplace, either in tanks or in pits, to frack. The water has to be stored someplace for the flowback water. Because it either has to be stored in tanks or in pits. The real difference is that, and this gentleman here said it just right, is if you could have a large centralized pit where the water will flow back to, you would be saving a lot. And we're not talking about initial wells, because initial wells are scattered around wells. But once they start into a development program, the idea that you could pump the water from one centralized location to another will save an incredible amount of wear and tear on the roads.
How will all these pipe transmissions, how are they addressed in what we're putting together?
That's exactly. Is that a minor?
Well,
those are above ground pipes, right?
Temporary.
Temporary above ground pipes. They're not.
What they do is that, unless they've changed, when I used to do it, is that you have 4-inch plastic pipe on a coil.
We can sometimes.
Pardon?
You can sometimes. We've actually went to 6-inch big collar connections. We used to use irrigation pipe,
Same thing.
aluminum irrigation pipe because it's bigger, but it wasn't a great seal, even though we're just pumping fresh water and it didn't look good because we had leaks. So we went to a more expensive pipe with big collar connection, pressure seal.
Well, the whole idea is that
And they're
it's temporary. From one location to another, you lay it on top of the ground, you have a pump at your source, and you get the water in volume over to the wherever it's going. I didn't realize it was a pump of 10 miles, but the number of just a minute, the number of trucks we're talking about, if you haul it for frack is what?
Well, if it's a 100,000 barrel frac, you get 100 barrels in the truck. That's 1,000 trucks, and that's just going in.
So coming back to your question about can't you haul it, there's not enough trucks in the world.
Well, they can haul. They've done, and that's why I asked. Isn't that what you did in Adams County? So they can do it.
No, you missed my point. You still have to for the trucks to haul it away, it still has to be stored someplace first.
No, you didn't have a pit. You just said that.
Let
In
me ask
Adams County, they did not have a pit. It came out of the well and into the trucks.
No,
Correct.
it goes into a tank.
When is it? Well, so
How do you get the water, whether it's going to be in a pit or in tanks, to that site? Assuming you don't have a well on site.
So it's and Sean's my completion engineer, so I brought the right guy here. But so we, Usually on the actual location where Elbert or Schlumberger, who is ever going to do the frac job, that's where the big pumps are that are going to push it in the well, you'll have 10 or so staging tanks on that location. Temporary portable tanks on that well that you're pumping from this pond to, and you're feeding those 10 or 8 or however many staging tanks.
How do you get the water to the pond?
To the pump? Well, multiple sources. In Arkansas, we'll actually...
No, Elbert County. How are you going to get the water?
From here, we buy it from the municipality.
And you truck it.
Truck.
Yes.
So it's the same truck.
And inside, I mean.
There's no diminution of truck traffic, whether you put it in a pit or you put it in a tank.
Initially, yes. But I want to reuse the water. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
so the next well, I don't have to.
And in our case, our real life example right now, it's just pumped directly from the well. And so, yeah, from the water well itself to the pit. And then
If you have a water well on the site.
Well,
Or close to the
or you have a water well 10 miles away from the pit. You go to the pit, and then you go another 10 miles to your location. I mean, you may have to put intermediate pumps in between, but it's you can pump it. And that's certainly what we've been doing to fill our pits. So we haven't had any water trucks.
But it sounds like we're possibly going to be dealing with pipelines running around with this water. In our 1041, that's where pipelines are dealt with as a separate issue.
Not this
How are they being addressed?
You're talking about.
I follow you, Curtis, but that's not that kind of pipeline. Our 1041, it's not a utility pipeline. It's a temporary, literally a temporary plastic pipeline that they have to get permission and easements, correct?
Yes.
From the property owners to run from one place to another. It's not like that, like an underground pipeline that.
Right, but I still wondered about how you were addressing that, so we didn't. This is the first time when I didn't left out.
To be honest,
all of a sudden got
right,
going back.
and to be honest, we haven't really talked a lot about that because this is really down the road. We all know that, right? We won't have to deal with these issues for a while.
In fact, it's further on in the stuff here that talks about trying to move water by pipeline.
I mean, we encourage it
So
because it's a positive thing for the county because it does
it
reduce
sounds like
traffic.
it would be something new to deal with if they proposed it in one of these, in the next 1 to 3 years.
So it would be part of the minor because under the minor they have to get the water from someplace. And they have to transport it from someplace to where they're going to use it. So the whole idea of having a temporary pipeline to supply the water for the fracking would be just part of the completion process.
Okay, but you could get into a bunch of extra detail. It sounds like you're dealing with the environmental and the leases and the different landowners and how you're...
It's possible, but I think that would probably be something we would address on a case-by-case
And
basis.
it doesn't sound like it
application.
would fit in the minor you're talking about, but more like in the full special use.
No. It fits in the minor. You
You
got to get the water from somewhere.
Right, I understand. But it's a pipeline.
But it's not a pipeline in the sense of a utility.
It's a permit.
No, it's not. It's not a pipeline in the sense of a utility, like a water system for a municipality, or an oil and gas pipeline that transports multiple operators. Stuff. It's a single-purpose, temporary.
Okay, well, I just wanted to be sure it was appropriately addressed, so we didn't end up with a hiccup. So.
And you're right, it will need to be addressed, but I think on a case-by-case basis. And the truth of the matter is we have no idea if we'll ever even have to deal with that.
And yes, and coming back to Tony's comment, there is you got to start somewhere, but until you start having wells, multiple wells in the county, you're not.
Many wells in the county. I mean, it really won't be worth it
Well,
unless
it's too
they
close
have.
together.
Yeah, I mean, until they have, half dozen.
If you were required to not use pits, would there be a circumstance where you could not economically extract them?
Yes, there could. I could envision that very easily. The cost to go complete fitness. Sorry. To go.
Why did they choose that word? Why did they call it reservoir? That's the worst word.
It's the pits. It can be really significant. You know, if I have to leave 119 tanks, is how many we used for the Adams County well. And, you know, they're $45 a day, times 119, and it costs $1,500 to have them delivered, and $1,500 to have them go away. So if somebody could do that math, those tanks have to stay out there for 6 months. It's, I think I did the math actually for Arapahoe County, it's $1.2 million versus digging a pit for $150,000 to $200,000. It's a huge difference in cost. So on a marginal development, and the one we've discovered so far is worse than marginal, it could really make a big difference. You're talking about double-digit percentage increase in cost.
Carolyn, I only have just really 3 kind of related questions. One is, with the insane weather that we get out here, I've lived out here 15 years, and we've had 2 rainstorms in the northwest portion of the county where we had 7 to, I think it was 10 inches of rain in 45 minutes. That's one concern. So I'm curious as to if there's some kind of cost-effective cover, because these rainstorms come out of the blue when they happen. We've had 2 major floods out here since 33 that were 24 inches in 24 hours. And that was fairly localized, but the entire county was affected.
Washed away most of the town of Elbert.
Right. We have constant wind out here, which is going to have a very real effect on the evaporation. I'm sure you guys have run into this elsewhere in other states. But at this altitude and at our level of constant dryness, that, particularly with the VOCs, that's a concern for me. And I think that goes back to, is there some kind of cost-effective coverage that you can do? And frankly, I wanted to say the whole idea about the piping thing, I think that's actually pretty cool.
Yeah. That's actually something we would encourage. Rick?
So I'd like you to respond to this. From 2008 to 2012, and this is all from the COGCC files, 44% of the spills have impacted and contaminated groundwater. 40% of the spills have resulted in or been caused by burn failures. Well, I don't think I personally have a problem with fresh water being stored in pits, but produced water I do. So I don't know if you can respond to that, gentleman, or not.
Well, I'm going to take the woman's question first because it was easier. So the state requires 2 feet of freeboard.
I don't know what that means.
Freeboard means it has to be 24 inches from the top of the berm at all times.
Okay, now if you have
Below
to put
the
this
top.
in
Below the top. sorry.
runoff area,
I'm sorry.
that's, if you put that in a runoff area, if it's not at the highest altitude on that property, that 24 inches on one of those rainstorms is no longer relevant.
Yeah, no, so there's a difference between a pit and a pond.
Okay.
So a pond is, you might want me to build you a pond, and we would gather fresh water on purpose in which it's a drainage area. Arkansas would build over 200 ponds. Farmers wanted them,
Well,
and then they
sure,
get to keep them.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more rain. They get 50, 60, 7 inches a year. Here, a pit cannot, by definition, cannot allow any surface water to run into a pit. Otherwise, it's not a pit, it's a pond. So we're talking about pits, and the state requires 24 inches of freeboard. They also require weekly inspection of those berms. So we have to inspect those berms, and besides that, they're lined, etc. So, what's that?
Then how come there are so many berm failures, as he just stated? If somebody's out there looking at the berm once a week, you telling me that they can't spot the onset of a berm failure
Yeah. So
next week or a week
right.
after that?
So I don't know the specific statistics or where that came from, but
COGCC.
I understand.
It's reality.
That was the original source. My point is, there's been exploration for oil and gas in Colorado since 1890 something. It's been around a long time. Pits have been allowed. They used to be used as the primary gathering facility. They didn't have tanks. You just put the oil and the water in the ground. So I don't know for how long that statistic went back. But berms and pits that ConocoPhillips and Southwestern Energy build today are inspected weekly. They're lined, whether we put fresh water or salt water in them, they're lined, they're supervised, they're fenced, and we're not in that statistic is all I can say. So.
And berms also apply to a berm around a production facility, around tanks, those types of things. And a lot of old, the old design was to use an earthen berm and just put some gravel around the location and there's a lot of old facilities, as you said. There's a lot of wells been producing for decades out here that have these berms. Those are, in all likelihood, I don't know the specifics, as John said, well, that's where all likelihood those berm failures are referring to.
Very old wells.
Now these locations are built with, steel berms, lined, those types. So where practice is today is different from what a lot of the existing operation.
This is 2008 to 2012.
Well, but those were facilities that were built that may have been built decades ago. That type of thing. So they're talking.
You understand my concern, though, right?
Old facilities.
You hear me what I'm saying.
Sure.
My concern.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pete, you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I guess.
You should be sitting up here.
I know. There's no chairs, I'm back there. There's a couple things. One, unlike the injection or disposal wells, anything that's on the surface is above the aquifers. It's, whatever it is, a couple hundred feet down to the aquifers. Anything that escapes from the surface will migrate down. So whether it's a tanker truck turning over, whether it's a pit leaking, that's one concern. I guess the questions I would have for you guys is, obviously these pits you described 100,000 barrels. Okay, was that 4 million gallons? 42 million, okay. Obviously not putting those in with one piece of plastic. There are seams in the plastic. Are those welded seams or are they just overlap seams? How do you construct those?
So they are a double welded seam that is tested.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a very specific, and they're not cheap.
Okay.
They're, I think the state requires 24 mil, Southwestern uses 40 mil.
Okay.
And if we think the pit's going to be in place for more than 3 years, so we actually have an internal kind of policy, we actually double line it. So if we think that pit, like in Appalachia, where it's very difficult to get pits approved, but once you do, it's going to be there for a while. Perhaps a bit like what Conoco's doing, where they're using it for lots of wells. We actually, it's amazing how they're engineered. They're very large, and I showed some pictures to Arapahoe County. We actually put, besides clay, first they're engineered, so they're gravel packed into rocks, then there's a layer of clay, then there's a liner, and there's a trench in the bottom of the liner that we put a piece of pipe in, then a second liner goes in, and so we've encapsulated that piece of pipe, and then we monitor that piece of pipe for leaks.
So would Renegade do that too, or is that just Southwestern that does that? Or maybe ConocoPhillips, the big companies? What about the small companies? Do they do that kind of work too?
We don't build pits like that, no. No, we drill with tanks.
Yeah, see, that's the
We drill
problem.
with tanks, we frack with tanks.
We're just dealing with all different.
We don't drill, we have not drilled a whole
confidence here, so we have to
need
come up with a way
5%
to
of
protect
the
ourselves from everybody.
space that they're talking about.
Like Renegade, he's out there figuring out ways to be bad right now.
I didn't hear it.
He's just harassing me. JD's, Renegade does vertical. I don't know if you have any plans to do horizontal, but at least at this point they only do vertical.
So
So
he's gonna have to tell me how good his wells are before we think about it.
Just to finish.
How much?
wait, I'm finishing them, and then you can have your say. Okay. Go ahead, Pete.
Just one more thing. So, in any of the pits that you've constructed, have you gone back, have you removed all the material from them, have you removed the liners, or you buried them in place?
So,
When you've done this way?
yeah, so we remove them, we can't bury them in place.
Have you ever found leakage in any ones you removed?
We've actually found leakage prior to wanting to abandon our testing system work. And so then we drained the pit, and we found the problems, and then we we welded the seam, retested it, and filled the pit back up. So we had a monitoring system that caught a leak in the first line of defense, and then we repaired it.
And that's one of these advanced pits where you have that sort of leak detection system.
Right.
Other ones that are not constructed at that same level of quality
Correct.
may not be able to, or come to
And
that same
I
level.
think your questions.
I don't really have an answer to that. I'm trying to dodge it. I just don't.
Well, and we're talking about
Hello. We need to have
the Arapahoe County MOU and the pit language that's within that.
Very
And
specific.
it goes into so much detail
Yes.
for us to address these types of questions and circumstances. That's why of the MOU, it's half of the MOU almost is pit language.
Well, that was actually the point I was going to make is that That's a really good question. Does Renegade build a pit like that? And I think that were the committee to decide that we were going to allow pits, we would need to include specific language about the construction of those pits.
I think that we've already, Rick, why don't you explain
Well,
what you just explained to me?
Wait, hang on one second, because this gentleman's been waiting patiently to make his comment.
I have one question. The pits, they're large. That gives you a lot of square footage exposed to the environment. What is, or how much odor comes off of these pits that, you know, here in Elbert County we got clean air. And how much odor are we going to experience that's going to be noxious, or whatever you want to call it, they're going to come off of these pits? Especially during the summer when it's hot.
Evaporation, VOCs, endocrine disruptors, cancer-causing materials that come off from the fumes.
Well, we don't use hydrocarbons whatsoever in our frac fluid, so there are no VOCs unless there's a VOC from a non-hydrocarbon.
From the flow back?
Yeah. So to answer your question, sir, I've been right next to many a frac pond, and I've never smelled anything.
Yeah.
The one we have in Arapahoe County is on our, I mean, it's right next to our office. I mean, it's within a couple hundred feet of our office.
Are there any state requirements, some documentation that we can find that covers what pits have to be?
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the MOU that I gave you from Arapahoe, it gives you the sections and so forth. You can go to and look at what the state regulations are about pits, but I do not believe that they're as stringent as what John has described.
Because that's what we need. We need some technical.
Well, and that's what the Arapahoe County's MOU on pits is much more stringent than the state's, and we've accepted them. So I would encourage you guys. You know, we spent 5 months talking about pits.
Now, their MOU, their pit MOU, let me try that again. The pit requirements are in their MOUs.
Yes, sir.
They're not in the regulations.
Because they're EMPs.
Yeah, I got that already. Right? That's what you said. That's the answer.
Because they're best management practices, and that's what we try to address.
Can I ask another question? It's purely ignorance. I don't know anything about the oil and gas industry. What's the cost? You said $1.2 million maybe to truck in tanks and what have you. What's the yield over 10 years of over?
Define yield, I'm sorry.
The revenue that you're going to get from it. I want to try and get a cost. What's $1.2 million over the life of your well?
So I would love to be able to answer that. I would love to. And I'm not being sarcastic. So we spent $11 million on the E-words. Our revenue was 0. So you calculate the yield.
I understand that. You have a lot of
but
bad wells.
But you
have a lot of good, the industry has a lot of good wells. Or you wouldn't be drilling. Let's face it.
But it may be the difference between drilling in this area and not. It doesn't hit your rate of reach, your target rate of return. You take your investment elsewhere.
$1.2 million would make that decision one way or the other?
Across the board, across the portfolio of wells,
per well.
It certainly could, yeah.
So I can quote you, right?
But that's not the point.
Well, it is to some people because, again, we're dealing with 2 Elbert counties. We're dealing with your Elbert County.
No, you misunderstood my comment. That's the cost of it's not the only point here. The other point is the reduction in traffic, the increased ability to reutilize the water.
I understand that.
So, you know, your $1.2 million is really only relevant to the first few wells.
Right. Well, once you get beyond that, it's almost different. You almost want to revisit this issue.
Well, once you get beyond that, you want to find every practicable use of that water for reuse. And so, what I think that the utility of these pits is really, in the initial case, is probably de minimis, except that you don't have to pay your rent. But as the fields develop, it becomes increasingly more important because of the ability to get rid of truck traffic. And, you know, they're not going to put a big pit like this in a schoolyard, because it wouldn't make sense.
So and here's one other challenge. If you're required to use artificial or manufactured tankage instead of an earth tank, so that's all it is. We're talking about building an earth tank versus a steel tank above ground. Now it's above ground. I got to build a berm big enough to handle 100,000 barrels. So I almost have to build a dike all the way around these 120 tanks.
Well, a pit isn't a tank, it's open. You know, a tank is all enclosed.
That would be the difference.
Well, that's a pretty big difference for the backflow, especially for the backflow.
The tanks aren't completely self-enclosed and sealed. There's venting off of the tank.
Yeah, they're vented.
There's also, if you store it in a private tank, there's also anywhere from 2 to 5 valves in that tank that could leak. And it only holds a certain amount, so you look at 100, 200 tanks. So that extrapolates your potential for leaks if you store it in tanks.
Below ground, a well-engineered pit, it's already below ground. It can't leak on the ground, it's in the ground. So I know there's a real bias against pits because we all have this vision of a bad berm and oil on a pit and a big rainstorm and it ends up in a ditch. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about engineered, lined pits that can't take freshwater flow in.
And you almost triple your footprint on surface to accommodate all these tanks on location too.
Unless you see it for miles and miles and miles.
Visual impact.
It just reminded me, and I'm just going to reiterate it because it bears reiterating. When Richard initially started writing his recs and doing his research, he went to Weld County because Weld County does more oil and gas by far than anybody else. And what the fellow who does this there told him was, if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it would be don't have pits. I'm just going to reiterate that because it is valid. Well, allow them.
They do allow them.
They allow them.
There's huge facilities, kind of like you just talked about, where they pump water for miles from these centralized facilities.
They do allow them, but Rick reminded me of that, and well, you know what? If Richard was here, I'd be able to tell you.
Most of that was related to the closed loop system. Well, that was more related to drilling than it was to handling frac
Well,
water.
yes, and no, I don't think so. But I think that, I guess my question is, it sounds like, just from listening to everybody, that there's not really a lot of concern over the fresh water pits. Would that be relatively correct?
I think we said that last 2 meetings ago.
The problem is the produced water. Is there a way around that? Is there a way to meet halfway of allowing freshwater pits, but not allowing produced water pits?
Well, you've got to understand that produced water is going to come back, and if you haven't got a pit, you're going to have to put it in a tank.
I know.
So that would mean that.
That's why I'm asking.
So they would still have to have a lot of tankage on site to gather the water. And I know you think that they can just back up a truck and they have to.
I'm not saying that.
They have to accumulate it somewhere.
I'm just saying that seems to be the general feel. Is there a way to accommodate it?
And then the second piece of this is that you can't keep the tanks on location indefinitely because of their cost. So that with the pit, you would be able to store the water there for a period of time to be used in subsequent wells.
What the trade-off is you have this open pit, which has some risks that we've been talking about, or on the other side you have a much bigger footprint with a whole bunch of tanks.
Yes, sir.
And what I hear you saying is the tanks aren't foolproof.
There is some risk with them.
Is that true, or is the option also that you can clean that water on site with portable processing equipment?
Despite what my good friend Rick over here says, the water that flows back is actually incredibly clean. So it's the parts per billion of anyway. The cleaning we do to reuse it is we blend it with other fresh water.
Well, I realize that.
It's all
Reuse.
it's all just to reuse it. Is all
But you could also process it, in which case the water can be used for a multitude of purposes. You don't have to pay that storage fee too.
How would you process it? Do you need to sell it?
Well, help me out, Dave. Is there a method of portable units to process that flowback water?
I've got 3. Where do you want one?
Oh, God.
There are technologies being developed
He's in the business.
for that. One, it's not quite there yet, and cost is the other part that goes into that.
We're running 65 cents a barrel.
I'm not the engineer on it, but it.
To me, it's conflicting for a little
Well, I mean,
while.
obviously, if you get something thrown at you that you haven't heard of before, that's unfair. You can't respond to that. But I guess what I'm saying is, maybe there is another alternative. Maybe we're looking too narrowly, and that's what I'm asking. Is there an alternative that would allow you to use pits for clean water, because that does save you some money, but maybe not for the produced water, because that makes our residents nervous?
So
What do you think?
I think there's a difference between what we are calling flowback water and produced water.
It's all the same water. It really is all the same water.
As John said before, Southwestern would not allow produced water to go into the pit because it's a different water quality than what we're calling flowback water.
Well, can you give a definition between flowback water and
salinity. We monitor salinity. And so when the salinity equals the reservoir salinity, you're producing 100% produced water.
But in reality, the water that you use in the frac is getting in contact with the producing formation. Therefore, it's been exposed to a hydrocarbon, whether it's gas or whether it's oil. So there's still going to be a VOC contact with the flowback.
Initially it's so. And remember, the flowback doesn't go from the well straight to the pit. The flowback goes through our test equipment. So it goes through a separator. So we remove any VOCs. If there's any natural gas with it, we remove the natural gas, we remove the oil, goes into a storage tank. We have a couple of tanks on location. The idea is when we're preparing for another frac and we're bringing in fresh water, maybe we got a water well, it would be nice and good for everyone to supplement the fresh water we're bringing in by draining off some clean flowback or produced water into that pit, if we're allowed to do so. If you don't want us to do so, it will deter recycling. It will.
Which you said before, and that's why I'm asking the question.
But could we do our business and not put any flowback water into an earthen lined pit that's properly constructed? Yes, we probably could. And then it would come down to economics. Depending on what sort of reservoir or operation we discovered, we might say, boy, we need to save that extra 15%, or we can't afford to develop these minerals. That could happen. Or maybe it's good enough where we don't care. We don't need to recycle. We'll buy fresh water every day because the reservoir is good enough. It's impossible for me to sit here and say which one we're going to have, right? I hope it's the second one. But so to answer your question,
there is an alternative, is the point. You could in fact clean that water on site and maybe sell it to some other. I mean, I don't know what you would do with it, but you don't. You're going to be drilling one well per, I don't know, how many months, how many whatever's out here. You don't want to store that water, or you do want to store it in an open pit for that period. But you can get rid of that water, not have the cost, and then get it back from some other source perhaps.
Yeah, we would not do this till we have a multi-rig program. So for us, until we have 2, 3, 4, 5 rigs developing, it really doesn't make sense to even attempt to reuse water. So I would just like to lay the groundwork for something that's 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and I guess.
And maybe it's premature, but I appreciate
the committee's got consensus here. But I mean, to me, you're posing a problem that's at least 2 to 3 years away. Right?
For us, yes. I can't speak
The use of pits. No, I mean, use of pits is current. Now, there's a difference again between drilling pits and freshwater pits. So again, and I think a lot of that was addressed. Closed loop drilling, I think, as John said earlier, Southwestern agrees with that. ConocoPhillips agrees with that. We're okay with closed loop drilling. It's just utilizing freshwater pits for the completion itself, which is different from closed loop drilling.
Are you currently reusing your flowback water?
Not currently.
So you're disposing 100% of it. So your pit is only being used for fresh water. So it can occur.
All right, so here's what I'm going to suggest. Okay, I think we.
Before we move that.
Oh, I'm sorry, but you had something to say earlier.
Yeah, thanks. Let me go ahead and just identify for you what the path ahead is. It seems like there's three options. One is there's already language in the document that we have that provides for a waiver. Okay, so if someone has a particularly good argument, they want to come in and convince the Planning Commission and the DOCC that they need a waiver for an open pit or an open pit in that regard, then that's available. It may not satisfy you, to be sure, and the process is not an easy one, to be sure, as well. Second opportunity is to go ahead, you need to be aware that the reason I asked the question about the economic concerns is if the state says, yes, oil company, you have the right to do X, Y, and Z, and Elbert County says you have to do this, and it can be demonstrated to the satisfaction of the judge that the requirement laid on by Elbert County is precluding the oil company from exercising a right that's been granted and permitted by the state, then you have a different problem. And it might
Rick, we do have land use authority, notwithstanding what the state has. And in terms of the particular surface use, this is a land use issue.
It is, and I would point out that Mr. Blogger sent out a document that I thought was very interesting regarding a county that has actually put together language on that very issue that tends to grade the area of state authority and county authority, and thank you for that document. The third alternative, besides waiver and this possibility of economic concerns driving a mandate, if that's indeed the case, is stopping and taking a look at the language that's been used elsewhere and perhaps thinking about including that in the MOU, which we haven't got to yet. So I think those are the three alternatives that are ahead of us. And correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, if you see it differently.
No, I guess that's right. Now, in terms of, I don't know, I'm going back and forth on this. I mean, if there's a possibility that we might be allowing some of these pits anyway through a waiver process, I'd rather have us see very clear construction standards that incorporate whatever the best practices are in terms of lining and burns and everything else that are the say very specific, so that we can have the county engineer go out and look, incorporate the cost of it into the permitting process, have our people go out and look at it, and make sure it's in compliance. I mean, it really is a balancing act here. I'm not happy about having this stuff exposed to the air, not the fresh water, but the flowback stuff, exposed to the air. But there is a price to pay if we say to these guys, you've got to tank it. I'm not so concerned about their costs as I am about increasing the footprints of the facility, increasing the visual impact. And those are, and those kinds of costs, those kinds of impacts are sure things. All right, the risk inherent in having a pit, having the construction fail in some way, or having some sort of defect, it is a risk, but it's not a certainty. Especially if we have clear specifications, have an inspection regime in place, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm coming down on this. So I guess, and I'm going more convinced of this as I'm talking, because I'm
convincing yourself.
I think because I kind of started out saying, I don't want these things, but where I'm coming down on it now is I think we should allow them under very strict standards and very strict supervision.
So I was going to make a suggestion, which was actually really your number 3 option, that we talked a lot about this, and you guys have the MOU from Arapahoe in front of you. You kind of see what that language might look like when you have a chance to read it.
Yeah, I read it, and it's pretty
detailed.
Yeah.
And so maybe this is something that we need to table for right now and let everybody kind of mull over. Because that's kind of what I noticed last time is, we wanted to resolve it, and so we did, and then later people called and said, I don't know if I'm happy with that resolution. Because they didn't really get an opportunity to really think all the way through. Does that sound right?
Would the committee be opposed to my putting together a straw man to look at when we get to that point in the MOU for consideration.
By that you mean, straw man, that's it.
A page to look at when we get to that part of the
you
MOU.
kind of outline what
Kind of an
people,
outline,
Yeah.
trying to capture some of the comments that we have around here. I won't put it into the document, but at least a separate page to look at. Actually, it turns out probably at least 2 pages.
Plus, it gives everybody a little bit of time, you know, we did these regulations over a long period of time, and we did a lot of research, but we kind of are down to the point now where it's really specific research. So it gives everybody time to kind of look into it a little bit if you want to. If you feel strongly about it, look into it, and come back prepared to have an opinion.
I would like to ask you a curiosity question. You said that you can treat this water for 65 cents a barrel,
Before the next meeting.
which is a way less than trucking costs. What do you do?
Ooh.
Proprietary.
Proprietary.
We have a number of different processes, but principally it's advanced oxidization, followed by density separation and filtration.
Do you bring equipment to the site?
Yeah,
Put it on site?
the unit consists of 2 40-foot skid units that sit side by side, and you sit it in between the frac tanks.
And at what rate can you handle?
At the moment, our max out rate is 24,000 barrels per day.
So that's 1,000 barrels an hour.
Yeah.
24,000 barrels a day?
But we've looked at water treatment, and one of the big downsides is that.
We'll take your card.
You've already got one.
I already got one?
Yeah.
No, sorry.
You're bad.
So to what, before you leave this, my knowledge is a bit dated. To what level of quality do you, for the 65 cents a barrel, do you get the water? Is it
For reuse in gel fry.
okay? So it isn't potable water when you're done.
No.
Yeah. Okay. That's,
Can I add one more thing? One of the letters that we received before you started with the committee, Rick, is from a law firm, and you all got this on the committee from Barbara Green wrote it. I think it's Jerome Paul. And one of the things that she explicitly says is that the county has the right to protect its water quality. Period. We have the right to do that. And if there's a chance that the pits are going to spill into our surface water or groundwater and contaminate our groundwater, we have the right to say no. Legally, we have the right to do that. And I know somebody was talking about that up here too. It's in fact.
Okay, I would suggest that you're absolutely right there, that we don't necessarily stop for the evening because we got a lot of ground still covered, but we table that until we will have a chance to read Arapahoe County's MOU and do some more thinking about it, and we'll take it up at the next meeting. Because it's one of those things that we're just going to talk about it and get splintered off.
Right.
And we're not going to concentrate.
I was also going to say, though, that if Mr. Bauer would like to elaborate a little bit, if you want to come to the next meeting and elaborate a little bit about how your process might fit into this, I think the committee would be really interested in knowing that. I know you have a pit PowerPoint. It's not very long. So if you want to do that as well, that's fine. But if this is an option, maybe we're breaking new ground here.
Well, it doesn't handle your storage problem.
No.
You still got to put the water somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So even with his system, you still have to do it. And the challenge that he's going to have is the fracking companies are quickly working on their, when you make it viscous, you make it gelled, right? So historically, those gelling elements, they're chemicals, they're polymers, didn't do well with salt water. So the water had to be fresh. But they made huge improvements to where now you can gel salts waters up to 50,000 parts per million. So it's a little less critical that it's as clean as it used to be.
I'm beyond that now.
Right. But you said your output is not potable, which we're okay with fresh water being in the pits, but if the output product is not potable, how's that different?
Kind of
So
defeats
it's
the whole
still not
purpose.
really. Yeah.
The reality is potable water the same as river water or well water?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of stuff floating around in the ground and on the ground already, but that's why we need to table it for a short time, for a while, because right now we're just letting our mind wander in too many different directions and getting away from the task at hand here. I would suggest we take a short break, come back, and then start going forward.
Cody had a comment, let's.
I was just going to add that is this something that could just be addressed in the MOU itself? Because I think right now it says it's kind of addressed in the regs, and then it's addressed in the MOU.
The reason it's in the regs, the history on that is that initially when we looked at that, we felt it was important enough that even though that was the only comment that COGCC made on our regs, we said, yeah, we know, but we're going to leave it in anyway, because it was that important to us. So that's why it's in the regs. If we move it to the MOU, that pretty much changes that whole idea. Basically, it said, we're going to leave it in the regs because we don't want to waiver on that point.
That's exactly right.
So while certainly we could, and we may come to that point, that's the history on that, and I guess the committee would have to think about it.
Yeah.
I know historically the argument's been made for an operational conflict when it comes to.
Yes, we know.
This,
We know. COGCC told us that. And we said, we know, we still going to leave it in there. So, I mean, it was kind of that sort of thing. It was that important to us that we said, most of the companies are telling us that really it's 6 one, half dozen the other, so they're not that worried about it. And we don't like it, so we doubt that COGCC is going to come down on us too heavy about it, and we feel strongly about it because we're so dependent on aquifer water. So we're aware of that. We're just going, la, 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 la. So let's take a break. Okay.
10 minutes. Can I get a card?
10 minutes. We'll back in, whatever. 5
What's your
First wire, blah. But we're confusing 2 or 3 different ideas in one sentence, and none of them are compatible.
Okay. What do you think about that?
I don't know. All kinds of red report and see it as an issue.
Well, this is not change language, but it's not right.
But it doesn't make sense. Okay.
Maybe we want to take out that and to reduce truck volume on county roads.
See, that's in the same sentence, and that doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, so the concern is.
No, but it doesn't make sense.
Right, then we have to see what we're going to do about 4x4 in terms of pits and before we can deal with this.
Yeah, you're correct.
I'm not saying you're wrong.
No. Basically, what we're saying, you got to use pipelines when we don't have pipelines and things like that. Basically, all we want them to do is to take the water to a licensed location and get rid of it.
Well,
No, I understand what you're saying. I think.
Or maybe I've got a graph.
No. I think you're. I agree with.
See, like that doesn't belong in that sentence.
I agree.
Okay, and then and this doesn't make sense either. So I should capitalize this. The operator shall transport wastewater to a central treatment location.
Section 5B. B is in
Okay, we have produced water and we have flowed out.
It doesn't matter what the water is. It's got to
But
be
some of it might have water in the pits or in the tanks or something.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Can we really deal with this
Until we
settle this other issue? I think your comments are correct, but doesn't this all have to be folded together with that other provisions related to how you deal with all that and this water? I mean, I think you're correct as far as it goes, but this other language will have to be folded into the subsection too. Because that's, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because this is about control and disposal of liquids.
Okay.
So do we want to skip control
Yeah.
disposal
For
now?
now, yeah.
And then
Right,
that's
so
something
maybe
that'll
that,
go
then
hand
they'll
in
come
hand.
back to.
Yeah, because we have to see what we're working.
And if you have language, Grant, that you are proposing there, if you want to send it to me,
Yeah.
I'll put it about.
No, he's right about what that makes sense and doesn't make sense.
Right, no, that's why I said.
Yeah.
C is about secondary containment. Anybody have any issues with that one?
Yes.
Okay,
Is this the one that said 50% of the volume of all the tanks on location?
oh yeah, this goes back to that one, doesn't it? Well,
No, it's the total volume.
Right.
It shall be
Total
sufficient to
volume.
contain the total volume of all tanks on site plus 50%. Sorry, 150% of the tanks.
I think that's excessive. I think 100. Well, I'm trying to remember what. That's
So
an
most
issue is all the time.
Graham was talking about a manifold leak where they're connecting rather than individual tank leaks.
Let me ask you a question of industry out there on your tank batteries. Do they have like check valves and that type of stuff on them? So if you do have a valve left open on one, they can't all drain out of one. In other words, in regular, on this side of the operation, this side of the refinery, you would never have tanks that were all controlled by one valve. You'd have individual valves feeding into a manifold.
Yes, there's an individual valve on every tank.
So the chances of all of them having a valve problem at the same time are pretty limited.
Correct. So, for example, a best management practice that could be put into your MOU is that in tank battery facilities, only those active tank valves can be allowed to be open. So if you could have them all open, that would not be good practice. So it's possible they are manual valves, but normal practice is you're filling up one tank at a time, only one valve.
So your contention is that the volume required at 150% of the total tank capacity in that burned area is excessive.
That is the standard in almost, if you have more than 4 tanks, you have much more than that, just the size of the berm. But if you only have 2 tanks, that's the standard language. That's the standard language
Because I think the verbiage, it's been a while, but I think the verbiage we were working with the regulations, and I think I don't know whether it was state or federal, it was 110%, I think. Does that sound familiar to you?
I know it's a state, right?
Yeah, I think it was
It's
110%.
110% of what?
Of the total capacity.
Largest tank.
Largest tank.
Largest tank.
And we're fine with 150% of the largest tank.
But not 150% of the total.
No, that's huge.
Okay.
Yeah,
I could kind of. I could kind of
just
see
change that to the largest.
The largest tank, yeah. I can see that. Okay.
that is pretty standard. I have read that in a lot of things.
Can I ask you a question though? In your calculations, your berm height is 1.67 feet. Is that a standard for some reason?
I don't know if it's a standard. I just grabbed it. I just guessed.
Because I look at when you just go up to 2 feet or 2.5 feet, you know, you get a lot more containment. And I just wonder why. If it,
Yeah, I took 18 inches, I guess, 1.5 or 1.6 or 20
close
inches.
enough.
Yeah. It could be 2 feet. Do we have a standard berm height?
We don't have a standard. For the one we're building shortly in the well in Arapahoe County, it'll be 44 inches tall.
Wow.
Why? Because that wasn't what was in stock. I wanted 33 because that was adequate, but 44 was in stock, so it...
Are they in 11, you go 33, 44, are they in 11 inch panels?
But 44 inches tall.
No, I understand that. But we're talking about those metal panels that go around, is that what we're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so is each panel 44 inches tall as a solid piece, or are they pieces that are fit together?
There's so many. This is a solid piece, so it's a solid piece to answer your question. But that's a fairly new thing to have these steel berms instead of the old earthen berms, and everybody and their son with a welder is getting into that business. So there's new sizes coming out every day. There is no standard.
And then what do you put on the bottom of the burned-in area? Do you seal that somehow?
You run a liner that's...
So you put a liner down, and then you build your tanks and things like that on top of the liner?
Right.
The liner's
and the
under the
liner's
tank.
secured to the side of the...
Yeah, okay.
And the liner is there first before the tanks are placed.
So the only reason I bring it up is that the committee wanted to. I ran 100, I used your spreadsheet, but 150 feet by 50 feet by 2 feet actually gets you 110% of the total volume. I still don't think you need it. But point is, raising that berm height just a little bit and making that area just about double gets you a hell of a lot of containment.
Well, I think if you're containing a larger volume than the largest tank you have, the chances of all tanks draining its income, like I said, is slim enough. So, and then you're talking about a burned area that's like acres and acres and acres if you want to get that total tank.
It's 100 by 50 feet.
I think that was fine. It's not a safety thing. But the main concern was grants, and you're okay with it, right?
I'm cool with it.
All right, so let's.
And I was the one that caused the problem in the first place.
Okay, let's just move on.
Yeah, sure.
Setbacks, pretty much.
Did you make that change? Should I take the actual number out?
Oh, yeah, and we should do that. I didn't, but
Where
you're
it
right.
says 500 feet,
Mhm.
that should come out. Otherwise, every time you see some changes there, we're gonna have to.
Right, we'll just take
Well,
out,
you're talking
that's
about
fine.
setback requirements, maybe granted by state setback. We're not gonna specify it. Just according to the regulations.
Odds are they're gonna go up.
Maybe granted last year.
Yeah, they go up, they go down. We don't have to change the range, they go up and we change.
Shall comply with COGCC. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, specify the regulations.
That's a good
Okay.
thing. That's a good thing.
Anything else there?
Can I ask what the proposed language is regarding setbacks?
It hasn't changed in the regulations. It's complies with COGCC.
Okay.
The memorandum, the MOU is where that came from.
Okay.
Okay, so the next section, the co-location of wells, and I don't, you guys do have a copy of that? Okay, good, okay. This is one that I really want to get through. This language came from, this language came directly from La Plata, with the exception of one per section. Originally, when we went out to view Wells County, the main concern that people had, or one of the main things that people commented on, was the proliferation of facilities. They were everywhere. So how do we consolidate them? And so I made a lot of phone calls with other jurisdictions who were dealing with that problem. And this was how La Plata was dealing with it, and so, and I knew it had been vetted by their lawyers and everything, and so I suggest
Just as a question, if I understand this right, and maybe I don't, but the number of well paths are limited. Now, is that for the wellhead itself, or does that include the production facilities? Because the production facilities may be a quarter of a mile from where the wellhead is. By production facilities,
Yeah.
I mean the tanks and the separators and all of those kind of things.
That's really a good question.
Because what will give them, what will cause more visual impact is not the wellhead. That's just a little Christmas tree out in the middle of somewhere. What will have more visual impact, if that's what you're trying to mitigate, is the production facilities.
Just a general comment here. I will not say that you can't do this, but if it's a vertical development, you're mandating well spacing.
That's exactly right.
And you're controlling the ability to develop the resource.
You can have as many as 16 wells on a section if you do a vertical development of a D or J sand, for instance. Correct.
The GOCC sets a different spacing unit, 640.
No, spacing unit is 1 per 40 for the whole state.
Unless changed.
Unless increased.
640 for horizontal.
In Swatch County, they say one well pad per 4 sections. And that was passed by the commissioners.
It's based on the geology. It's based on what's underground.
Here's the dilemma, and I think that these guys are pointing it out, is that when you drill horizontally, well, let me say a couple things. One is, depending on the ownership of the minerals to which that well has been drilled, you'll have to have you have a separate well storage facility for each sets of ownership, because of and by that I mean the royalty interest underneath. So what I'm trying to figure out is what we're trying to mitigate here. Are we trying to limit the number of spots where wells can be drilled? Are we trying to mitigate visual impact, or what we have? And then we'll come back and address the spacing unit. We've got to figure out what we're trying to do first.
Okay.
I thought it was production facilities. Originally, that's what we said we'd like.
Yeah, we've said all along that we'd like to see them consolidated in
It was a visual facility.
Yeah, but this doesn't do that. Or unless you're saying that the production facilities have to be placed on the drilling pad.
Well, I'm not saying this. This isn't really new language. This was language that we talked about. If there's some other alternative, let's talk about
Well, I
it.
think we were talking about the spacing issue as well, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what we're trying to do here.
Right.
Is it trying to get the production facilities clustered?
Yes.
Is that what we're
The
trying to
idea
do?
was the visual impact of the proliferation of facilities.
So not well pads then?
Well, this is how they handle it.
Well, that's fine, but well pads, to me at least, would suggest where we actually physically drill a well.
Yeah, and that was why I think they went about it this way, is because they weren't limiting wells specifically, they were limiting the well paths. And I think the assumption here was that the pad most often would be large enough to incorporate the facilities, the tanks.
But typically, what happens is the well may be drilled in the middle of the section or in a far corner of the section, but typically the production facilities will be placed somewhere close to a road, and the produced fluids will be piped from the wellhead itself to where the production facilities, by that I mean the tanks and the separators and all of those kinds of things.
It really depends if there's two very, very different types of developments. There's vertical well drilling, which could be drilled on 40 acres, and horizontal drilling. Vertical well drilling has offsets from the county lines and from the lease lines, so you tend to drill out in the fields, and there the production facilities tend to be not right on the well. In fact, they reclaim, so there's very little well pad, maybe a pumping unit. We just drove past two in Elbert County on the western side of Alberta. Yeah. And there's two little pumping wells out in the middle of this field, kind of below the hill, and they just had a little gravel pad around them. Grass and sod was every place else, and then they had the facilities up on the road. But let's say I have a 40-acre lease, and I drill a vertical well, and I put a pad. Are you saying that nobody else can develop their minerals because there's already one location in that section?
Well, no, and that's why I was saying that we probably need to change the number of paths. This was what the consensus the committee came to, but that's not what La Plata does. La Plata does 4 per. The other option...
Is La Plata County? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, and they have quite a bit of oil and gas. They've been dealing with oil and gas for a long time, and they have the attorneys who don't. The other option that we discussed that was in the first 64-page document, okay, that didn't make it to this document, was the idea of only 3 per mile.
Yeah.
Well, what we're trying to do is get them to cluster the production facilities.
Right.
And the operators are going to want to cluster the production facilities because we have so few roads in the county. So the idea of encouraging, and that doesn't mean that it would be on identical paths. Just that the production facilities themselves would try and make them contiguous. There might be Noble Oil Company here, ConocoPhillips here, and Southwestern here. But when we made the trip up to Well County, it seemed like the production facilities were
Every 10 acres.
were just kind of randomly dropped.
Right.
There's a lot of vertical well development there too.
Yeah.
A lot of old wells.
A lot of old wells on vertical paths. So
And they even have some 10-acre spacing up there.
sure. Yeah. So my suggestion, if you want to try something like this, is limit it to horizontal wells only, because otherwise you're going to end up in court. You can't set vertical well spacing. I mean, I shouldn't say you can't. You're going to have a challenge on your hand. But if you're really
To be
thinking
honest,
about,
I didn't mean, think about the horizontal, and I guess I would have to ask to apply that. I don't know how they did.
Yeah, if they limit it to horizontal developments, now we don't need as many wells. That's why we drill horizontally. But one per section we'll have a big problem with that.
In our estimate, in our success scenario, in all likelihood, we're going to need either 2 to 4 well pads in a section, and that's on the scenario that we control all the acreage under that section. There's not another operator that has their own. And in that case, we would have to go get this waiver for half to 3/4 of our applications.
Can we deal with what the issue we're really trying to get at here, which is the production facilities?
I think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, but I mean, couldn't you say something like, instead of calling this co-location of wells, call it something like consolidation of production facilities, and say something like production facilities for operators permitted well pads shall be consolidated to the maximum extent feasible, taking account of, and then, we have
ownerships and things like that.
Well, topographic characteristics.
Oh, I see, go back to that.
Yeah, in other words, forget about the well pads.
So maybe add ownership?
Just let me think about what we're just saying. So, what we're trying to accomplish here is, if you have multiple operators in a section, is that they will be, their production facilities would be, you can't say consolidated, because they're
Adjacent?
Contiguous, perhaps?
Contiguous?
Is that?
clustered. They would be clustered in a small geographical area. And by clustering, I'm just kind of thinking like a...
Or shall be located as close to each other as feasible, given, and then we'll figure out what, again, topographic characteristics, natural resource, we have to
I like that.
And we talk about what we're really concerned about, which isn't the well.
It isn't the well at all, because once after the well's drilled and fracked, all you're going to see is something the size of this tabletop.
Minimize the footprint. Minimize the footprint. All facilities shall be designed such to minimize the footprint.
Well, John, what they were trying to do is, when we have multiple operators in this section, that they don't put their facilities on the 4 corners of the place, that they bring them to some localized area.
Well,
and that's
I don't know.
better utilization of roads and all those.
And then we talked about.
We had the spacing issue.
I mean, we can certainly write in there that says, consolidated facilities, but there's nothing concrete there.
I think what we want to do is that, to the extent that there are more than one operator in a section, that the production facilities will be clustered.
Could we say contiguous? Would that bother? Because clustered to me, I don't know what it means.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Are you saying I have to build my facilities next to Comic-Con? Is that what you mean by 2 different operators and cluster?
Yeah, and the big problem is going to be the surface use agreement.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So it depends on my landowner. My landowner's going to tell me where I'm going to build my facility.
Right.
And where your wells are drilled at too, because if you've got a mile of flow line, you've got a production facility on the east section line, and you're drilling well on the west section. I mean, there's just so many scenarios here that it's...
Well, can you tell us how we might, you know what the objective is so it doesn't look like that somebody went up into a very high airplane and dropped the facilities and they just landed where they may. What we're trying to do is get them to be clustered, and I use that word, I don't care what, if we co-located, adjacent, contiguous, all those words work. But the whole idea is that if one operator has some facilities along the road, rather than going a mile down the road and building another one, that they would be similarly located. Now, I understand that unless you unitize stuff, you can't co-use the stuff, because I tried to do that once myself, and it didn't work.
You might want to think about this. You get enough of it, wildly successful, and you get enough of these, people are going to drive by and think you got a commercial disposal well sitting there because you got 37 tanks all in a row.
Yeah, but if you have the facilities every quarter of a mile, and that's, I think, what...
right.
and this was a comment that'll come out of our trip up to Well County, and that is that, gosh darn, why?
I can't put them all in one place.
Yeah.
To the extent practicable, operators in Elbert County will cluster their
Some of it is
facilities.
going to be determined by road and bridge. They're going to say,
Right.
you know, we can't have 4 accesses to a county road within a quarter of a mile. So,
I think language that it'll be a little qualitative, it's not going to be really harsh, but I think to say is the county's objective and desire, or however you want to put it, we can agree with that, but even us sitting in this room, we're going to be, it will be very hard for us to say, yes, that's okay to a hard, fast rule, because there's mineral interest, there's surface, there's a lot of stuff we don't control.
yeah, and if the neighbor says, thou shalt not come on my land, even though he likes conical,
Yeah,
but
that's
doesn't
right.
like you for whatever reason,
Yeah,
you can't force him to rent his land to you.
I can't.
So do we want consolidation language at all?
I'm just saying that.
I mean,
I
no, I'm not being a smart aleck.
No.
I'm saying, you know, you guys wanted this, so we came up with this, and if this is not realistic,
Well,
then do we need it at all?
this does not accomplish what we set out to accomplish. This co-location language does not.
And that's fine. But what I'm saying is just saying that the county's objective or desire is to consolidate facilities. Does that mean our objective?
It doesn't.
So is there any point to the language at all?
I don't think so.
It seems, yeah.
I mean, Tony, you
Yeah,
felt strongly about this. So.
I know, and I still do, but the trouble is, you know, what we're gonna run into when people have a public review, it's gonna be a sighting, and there's gonna be another sighting, it's gonna be just like Gulf County. Every quarter mile, you're gonna see a minor facility.
So how would you deal with it?
The main
Give me the
thing, what's
realities.
the main thing that you see?
The
It's
reality
those
to me
tanks,
is,
right?
force them
It's
to
not
get
about
a
that.
40-acre land use agreement to consolidate.
Yeah, but they can't force the landowner to do
They
it.
can find somebody, though. They might not, that's the problem. We might run into the operational conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, I could put feel-good language in here if you want, but that's all it is, because it doesn't really do anything.
See, I think this is gonna be a sticking point. I think that's gonna be the objection, one of the objections.
Any ideas?
I will say in Arapahoe County, they did, because there were a few of these rules that they really wanted to express their opinion, they wanted to share with the public that those people making those rules cared and listened, but it was kind of out of their ability to make a hard, fast rule. They went ahead and made some, it is the county's objective, or is the county's, preference or whatever. So when we go in for a permit, yes, it's not a hard, fast rule, but you could say, well, why are you putting it there? You know, is there a reason you're not putting it over there? John, I want you to spend another week talking to that landowner, because it says our preference. You're right, you can't force it ultimately if we argue, who knows.
Well,
But there may be some benefit, I'm saying, to put soft language.
We can put stronger language in too, because if there is an operational conflict, we have an operational conflict procedure. And if they can't make a deal, they can come in and say, we've got this problem, and there's a waiver. There's a waiver process. So we could have stronger language. It gives the county some negotiating leverage with these guys.
Could we say something that, to the, and I'm not wording this as a lawyer, but to the extent practicable, production facilities will be co-located? Something like that.
I don't know how to do it. How do you do that? I mean, you got a well on one lease, and you got a well somewhere else. What's going to incentivize you to co-locate?
So it's usually in our best interest. I mean, generally, it's in our best interest to co-locate, and the better we can keep our facilities together, it's so much easier operationally.
Less
locations to take care of.
The gas gathering company brings one line up and puts a meter run over here and a meter run over here.
It's generally in our best interest. It just can't. There are so many different factors at play that you can't always accommodate that.
And you can see that when we went up to Well County, you'd see where there'd be multiple wells, probably with different royalty interests, that were co-located. You'd see 6 or 7 separators lined up in seriatim. So obviously they were trying to co-locate those facilities to the extent they can. Where the problem comes in is not, if you've got the similar operator, I think it becomes quite easy. Because then there's one guy negotiating with the same group of landowners. Where you have trouble is if you have two separate competing operators. And to get them to co-locate, I think we want to nudge them towards that if we can, but we won't always be able to get it, I don't think.
Is there a language we could put in that says you will co-locate at the time of application, or unless you can show cause why it can't be done, then we would grant the waiver. So a little bit more fight than just saying give your best shot.
Let me ask you a couple more questions. Are you saying co-locate facilities within a section, or are you talking about a larger geographical area?
I don't know, Grant.
This was said in sections.
Yeah, I know.
We include stronger language
before we knew what we had.
for facilities that are all owned by the same operator, and allow for more flexibility where multiple operators are concerned.
I think the easiest way would be to say something that, to the extent practicable, the operators will be expected to co-locate production facilities.
I just don't know how that translates to a requirement.
Do you have to find the waiver thing?
When you talk about the something
A square section is, or are you talking about anything within miles?
No, you're talking about a numbered section.
Numbered section.
Yeah, it may be 620 acres, it may be 647 acres.
But like you could have two sections, you could have a city like this, one on each side of the town.
That's the reason I asked the question.
Okay.
So what do we want to do?
I think a single operator should be required to co-locate, but he's going to do that anyway, for the most part.
Yeah, and then we have to talk about geography.
Right, subject to all the
So if we had language that says something like a single operator operating multiple wells in the same section will co-locate. In the case of, obviously I'm speaking that, but in the case of multiple operators, it is encouraged and preferred. I mean, would language like that work?
Maybe with the addition of what you have in here, as far as the impractical, what's rendered impractical from topographic, and I mean, because you could have 50 landowners in one section too. Maybe not how John's operating, but
So you mean include this language in requiring a single operator to co-locate, right? Is that what you mean?
right on the single operator requirement.
Is it possible for us to write language so that we suggest strongly that all wells co-locate, and then in that language specify that there is the waiver route if they can show good cause? Because you say that just like you like to group together, you just naturally are attracted to each other. But I mean, that would be the cheapest way to do business.
The only thing is
share your resources and stuff. But what I'm looking at is something where we can, because we obviously it's physically impossible to.
But you're injecting a waiver process into.
But
the
more I think about this, the more I think that it's really highly desirable, but I don't know how to do it. And the reason is what happens if you've got contiguous sections, one in each side of the road?
Well, I was just thinking exactly, why would you limit it to just to a section?
Yeah.
I mean, why should the section line be any different? But then how far does it spread out?
Well, and then you've got to go to the next step. Okay, if that guy has to put his production facilities on the other side of the road, that means he has to dig a ditch across the road. So all of a sudden we're
And he has to get permission from the surface owner on the other side of the road to put facilities from this section on that side of the road.
Operators will, to the extent practicable, locate or cluster their production facilities with existing.
Or at a single location.
So first guy in says, right, both. Next guy in, you will put it over there unless
you can.
It's not practical.
Yeah.
You know?
See, that's what I'm saying, the way
Don't go with
You're
it.
essentially basing
Yeah, and so if they read deep enough.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the waivers are there for when we can't really completely hard to pass, and so we're
Yeah,
trying
the
to.
big problem is
can't,
if
and the
I'm a landlord,
prove that.
if I'm getting a royalty check on this side, but not on that side.
But you remember, we did that, we stood on the road in Weld County.
Oh, no.
And we said, my God,
I want to do
it's
it.
a dirt road, the county can let them dig it, and you do it to get permission, yeah, you gotta have a surface use agreement.
So, anyway.
I think that's the
Okay, so
simplest
is
way.
the agreement basically that we're gonna include it by a slot language? Am I understanding?
I think so.
Well, no, John's line.
John's line.
John, can you say that to me?
Yes, ma'am.
So basically, we were saying to the extent that it's practical, you'll be encouraged to co-locate.
Yeah, you will go like it, it will be practical.
Yeah,
You will.
Okay, so the next one is definitions.
So this language is in here, will basically
We're
come
gonna take
out.
that out, that'll all come out, and I will get it to you as soon as I can.
So you just, Carolina, for a minute on co-location, because for me, when I hear the word co-location, it's kind of important. So when I hear the term co-location, it means I have to put my equipment on that same location. Conoco will not allow my people.
No,
so we're taking that out.
Okay, so don't use the word co-location.
No, I
I
think we
could
were
say
gonna use,
co-locate/cluster, whatever the proper word is.
But
Cluster.
here's the most, here's a development that we've used successfully in lots of places. So if we're only drilling 1 mile long laterals, some places they drill longer. But typically, and I could easily see in our development, we're going to have 4 laterals per section. We'll have 2 pads near the southern section. So we'll have 2 pads, and we'll drill 2 wells from each pad to the north, and we'll drill 2 wells going south. So in 2 square miles, we're going to have 2 pads, and we're going to have 8 wells. My pads are not going to be clustered, because I'm going to put my facilities on that pad with those 4 wells. Now I might need to have 2 facilities, because the interest owners in my wells to the south may be different than my wells to the north. So I'll have 2 separate, so I will co-locate those, I guess. But don't write it so I have to co-locate it for the whole section. Because I can't, there could be a million different developments.
I don't think there's anything in this wording that
Okay,
says.
all right.
can you read it again, John?
Operators will, to the extent practicable, co-locate or cluster, whatever the right word is, their production facilities with existing.
How about consolidate? Is consolidate?
Again.
I'm okay with cluster. Clusters, they're co-locates.
Consolidate almost is like co-locate.
Okay.
We're gonna use the same tag.
Either one.
Yeah.
Okay,
Cluster.
so for the title of it,
Okay.
somebody had suggested consolidation of facilities, but we don't like that word, so we want to say clustering facilities.
Now, circling back, the language that we had for special circumstances, or site-specific circumstances? Yeah, and where we put all those wonderful things in there.
Right.
I guess they would kind of apply back to this. Okay, so
The operational conflict process, the waiver process, all that stuff applies to all this.
Yeah. And if you'll remember how we worded that site-specific circumstances, if you can't come up with a story that's good enough, you're not very imaginative, because it's broad enough there that if there's a reasonable reason, it's included in that definition.
Okay, so the next section is definitions. I had added those ones that you suggested, at least I thought I did. The flow lines. So it doesn't look like it in here, does that? Well, I had intended to. So I will add those to flow and gathering lines as separate definitions. I went to the beach today. Is there anything else
No, that's not.
in the definitions that either we have trouble with or the industry has difficulty with?
I don't believe I have the most recent version that has, I don't know, so a couple of points that we had pointed out, that flow lines and
Yeah, and I added those.
and then the recycling facility.
The integrated recycling facility?
Yeah, mine's blank.
I thought I did that.
you know, where we had that site-specific circumstances definition, we included it in the regs. I was looking for. That's fine. I don't. It's okay.
No, it's in the regs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the regs. There's just a couple of things that we need to fix there, and it probably has to do with my Canadian accent.
Did we misspell about?
Where it says it's standard, and I'm in page 8, policies, yeah, and I'm down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines where the sentence starts. The standard MOU may be amended where there is demonstrated need to accommodate site-specific circumstances included but not limited to. I would like to add topography in there.
Okay.
And that's, you know, steep slopes
Right.
and that kind of stuff. And then you've got oil and gas reservoirs. I think that what you take out oil and gas and put reservoir management. Because what we're talking about there is like the injection wells, the how dense the wells are, the locations are, and that type of thing. And then historic.
Okay, wait. Say again, management?
Yeah, just strike oil and gas, and just put reservoir singular.
Reservoir management?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then historical data location. I wasn't. I'm not saying that very well. Historical data. I didn't know if you wanted to have what you meant by data. If you wanted to have historical sites or something. I'm not going to fight the word data. I
didn't come up with this language, so I didn't mean anything by it.
Like I said, I had a speech.
That's something real, I think. Grant and I.
I think I had a speech deflect when I said that.
So do you want to do that?
No, you want historical something in there. I was going to historical site, but data's. And then the rest of it's good.
Okay.
If we're cleaning some stuff up, then can we go to page 2?
Carol.
Okay.
Did you make that change to the
I'm not
subsequent? Okay,
I did.
the last paragraph.
Okay, well, let's come back to this second.
Okay, under non-conforming use, subsection E1.
I'm sorry. Page 2?
Yeah. Right there, okay. Afterward it says, in the second line, so long as the use is not inactive. I think you can strike everything down to the word as in the fourth line from the bottom. So it just reads, so long as the use is not inactive as defined by the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Blah, blah, blah. Because the stuff in between, you don't really need. Yeah.
Well, inactive is 12 months, and we got closer to 18 or 24.
Yeah.
Right, no, but we decided to say as defined, we just decided to leave it to the inactive as defined by COGCC. We did away with those deadlines.
You're right.
Yeah. We don't need to refer to 18 or 24. Just refer to the COGCC regulations.
But COGCC is 12, and we thought you guys had agreed to at least 18, if not 24. I thought there was some.
We did. In the last meeting,
we agreed to 18. What's the difference between inactive and abandoned?
18 was what we originally had. What it originally said was, is not abandoned for an uninterrupted period of 18 months or more. For wells abandoned shall mean plugged-in abandonment of a well, temporarily abandonment of a well, or shut-in of a well. What we did last time was, these were comments from the industry, was change that to so long as the use is not inactive rather than abandoned, for an uninterrupted period of 24 months or more, as defined by the Colorado
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Right, that's a conflict.
Yeah, and what I recall us deciding to do was just go with the COGCC. You know, we said, well, we don't worry about these.
Well, okay, what's weird about that is that the COGCC regs say 12 months. We originally had 18 months. We changed it because we were responding to the industry comments, which wanted a longer time period. So that makes no sense.
A longer time period before they took action.
Right. So to go with COGCC does the opposite of what they asked for.
We don't have to do everything they asked for.
Well, no, but I mean, we wouldn't have even addressed it at all, So we might be wrong, but I don't think it's wrong in that.
Whatever,
Do we want to say, we wanted actually to define, I think, inactive rather than.
That's a little bit more, having more discussion about what's inactive and what's abandoned.
Right. I don't remember the discussion.
Some of the stuff we're talking about is stuff we talked about over a year ago, so.
This is the last meeting. And that's why I'm saying we wouldn't have even talked about it, because we've already said 18 months. If we were going to go to COGCC, which is shorter, we talked about it because the industry comments said they wanted more time.
Yes,
More time before they had to take action.
Right.
But
Do you follow what I'm saying then?
No.
Okay, so originally we had 18 months.
I know that, right.
All right, we wouldn't have commented on that at all, except that the industry commented on it and they wanted more time. So it wouldn't have made a lot of sense if instead we had come out with a shorter period of time.
I understand. You know, Mike Grant, I don't know what you think of this, but are we at a point where we need to get another, I hate to say it to you, another version of this to review? Because I'm not sure our notes are all,
Yeah, I was just thinking.
I'm not sure our notes all coincide anymore.
I think you're right, Tony, but let's get through these things at least now, and then we'll get a fresh copy back from Carolyn.
But you know, Carolyn, if the state says X, then we're obliged to do X. If you say X plus 2, it might look good on paper, but
You're still.
I'm still obliged to do
Higher
X.
standard
Yeah.
of care, which is.
We've been more restrictive in a number of places, but now suddenly you're being less
Less restrictive.
Well, we
and-
adopted COGCC rules last time, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the word is ever got.
Let's remember what we're trying to accomplish here. And that is that the facility is inactive for a period of time. We've got to clean up the things and get the production facilities off of there. And hopefully we're encouraging them to abandon it and reclaim the area. So,
Okay, how about if we all
saying
look at our
inactive
notes?
as defined by, I see, so you want to say inactive as that term is defined by COGCC for 24 months or more.
Well, but
Yeah,
it's defined by the COGC as 12 months. So I don't pick, that's my recommendation. Pick your time, the last meeting was 24 months.
Yeah, this
say,
probably happened about the same time of the last
Yeah.
meeting.
no production for 24 months, you gotta get rid of the low blood
Well,
sugar.
we're confusing ideas that were presented at the time. The idea presented at the time was what is abandonment, what is temporary abandonment, and all of these other things. And what I think Carolyn was trying to do is use those definitions and extend the time. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
I think it's
because the abandoned, we didn't like the abandoned. Maybe the abandoned said 12 months.
Kyle, I think
COGC is confusing.
definitely did, I think, 12.
Because you can do a mechanical integrity test on a well in 5 years. So I don't know who said 12 months for COGC.
Inactive well is no production has been sold for a period of 12 consecutive months. Any well which has been temporarily abandoned, which is defined for a period of 6 months, or an injection well which has not been utilized for 12 months.
Okay.
I thought that section, based on our last meeting, needed to be started over from scratch, not underlined here and added here, because I think we all need that.
So what we actually wanted to say,
Pardon?
so what we actually wanted to say
Yeah.
is first of all, use the term inactive rather than abandoned, correct?
But then inactive it?
Is that correct?
Yes.
And we wanted it to be for 24 months.
Yes.
And what we don't want it to be is defined by, is the word inactive defined by oil and gas.
Correct. I believe that's correct.
Well, how are we going to define inactive?
As 24 months. And you can put it back in your definitions if you want to.
Well, that's where it is.
This doesn't have to jive unless referenced with the COGCC rules. These are your rules.
But can
See, now here's you could argue you have to comply.
usually you can't be less restrictive. You can be more restrictive.
That's what I'm having a
Not
problem
less
with.
restrictive.
The state says 12.
No. The state defines inactive well as 12. It doesn't say then remove the equipment. It
Really,
just
it came
defines
down
it as 12.
to semantics,
And so
inactive,
that's
abandoned,
what we're
right?
doing. We're
It's-
talking about when you need to pull stuff.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
causing action.
Yes.
Okay, we have to.
At 24 months,
So,
after
so
things that are
the
not
state's
reasonable.
still, the state's, we're talking about.
I think what was going on with this was, I think I got it. We were talking about, this is non-conforming, and the issue was if it's an existing well, they do not have to come into compliance with these new regulations unless they were inactive, they didn't produce for a period of time. And I think one of the things that came up was you brought up the issue of you got something broke, you wait for parts, whatever, you ask for a certain amount of time. I suggested at that point that we pick a window of time, but basically without notice, so that if you can't get that new piece of gear within the 6 months, 12 months, you tell the county, hey, this is why I'm inactive, this is how long it's going to take to get this part, then we can adjust that time. But the idea with this was allow them some slack if you had to change something out so that they could not keep their well going or get it going again.
The logic is exactly because we didn't do it last meeting, we did the meeting before.
No, it was a couple of meetings.
You were here last meeting.
I wasn't here.
And I think what we're trying to do is make it consistent with other things we do, which are on a 2-year cycle. Like if somebody comes in as approved for development, 2 years, after 2 years, boom, they're out of the box. So I think that's what we're trying to get consistent. It's coming back. We're trying to get consistent with our other regulations, so that we didn't have all these differences in how long an application is good for or a permit is good for and such.
It's amazing how we all remember this differently.
This is why we gotta get this done, because
See, the way I remember it is you just can't leave unpainted tanks out there forever.
I wish we could just put that in there. That'd be great.
paint your darn tanks.
Please don't leave your tanks out there forever.
I wish I could put that in.
Well, then what if it just said,
Well,
shall be
originally
allowed
it
to
said
continue
12
so
months.
long as the use
September.
is not interrupted for a period of 24 months. We don't use inactive or abandoned. Because that's what we're getting hung up on is, okay, so if we use inactive, then we go to the definition of inactive and it gives us this time frame. So maybe we just don't use those words. And instead, we just say is not interrupted, so the use as well, right?
Or is not stopped? Or is it
Well, the original, going back to the September, it shall be allowed to continue as long as the operation does not cease for an uninterrupted period of 12 months.
So what was wrong with that?
Beats the hell out of it. And that's in this version of September 11th.
It's too short.
Or September 2000. No, that's just the first paragraph. The second paragraph.
That works just fine for
What do we get rid of that?
The only thing we need to add
Never leave
at the
it.
end of
Never
the
leave it.
24-month period, all surface equipment will be removed.
Okay. Okay.
We could have stopped this whole process like 6 months ago.
we should have. I thought we had. No, it's a time.
Well, the
Didn't we
problem
take it
with
to
the
the
September
version twice?
Rick, the
Yes, we
problem
did.
with the September 2011 version is that was 60-something.
64 minutes. Okay, so then you had something.
Oh, I was just confirming that the changes I sent to you
Are they in there?
got made.
Did you
Because
look?
I haven't seen them in the version.
Oh,
I was a minute and a half late, so I.
oh, yeah. Do you remember where they are?
Yes.
I think I did. She thinks she did. I got 8,000 versions of this thing.
Yeah.
Let's
start deleting.
Actually, I deleted a bunch of them. I did
On
have
page
them.
8, last paragraph, third line,
Yeah.
characteristics of subsequent facilities, because you're not going to change the MOU to the first one.
Where are we looking on this page?
Policy
Third
statement, the last paragraph, once an MOU is agreed upon, is how it starts. You see that?
Director of CDS says that differences in the characteristics of a facility or conditions.
Right, should be a subsequent.
Subsequent. Because you're not gonna change the original MOU.
Or subsequent conditions?
No.
That the differences in the characteristics of a subsequent.
At a subsequent facility.
Or conditions at its proposed location. Yeah.
Because you're not changing the MOU for the first facility.
Okay. So I guess I didn't get it.
So I was running us through all of the regulations.
Yeah.
Karen, the definitions.
Just to comment on definitions on the minor oil and gas facility, now that we've added a non-commercial injection or disposal facility, should we add that in the definition of the minor? A non-commercial.
In the definitions?
Those definitions need to be conformed to the definition, either taken out or conformed to the
It did. I'll make a note.
But it's pretty significant. Oh, it should be taken out of the definition. It's not consistent with the body.
Right, it should be either taken out of definitions because it's defined in the body or.
We just.
Okay.
Well, I'll make it conform.
Sounds good.
Okay. So that's the end of the regulations. Is everybody pretty happy? Do we have anybody else that wants to?
I think
I need to say we'll have a seat, right?
Yeah, you know what takes so much, Carolyn?
I don't.
Okay, so the other, we'll start on the MOU next week.
Well, we're going to have the pit thing.
Yeah, I would really like it if you would do a presentation for us and talk to us about what you do, so that we have an understanding of it and can make determinations of whether that will fit in our vision of what we'd like to see in the and you as well, your pit presentation, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Did you plan to come to the next meeting?
When is it?
You love us, don't you? You just love coming here every Tuesday.
So I brought Sean. This is Sean Burke, by the way. So if you don't see me, one of us will be.
Okay.
I needed help.
And when is the next meeting?
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
Unless that doesn't work.
Works for me.
Okay. The other thing that I want everybody to think about, okay?
Next Tuesday is the 12th, March
12th,
12th.
I think, is in the eventuality that we don't finish with the MOU, which I really hope doesn't happen. But in the event that we don't, let's everybody maybe think about how Arapahoe handled it and see what they think about that, how they broke it up.
I don't have to.
Should have to.
These are the regs.
I have it right.
Oh, these are how they broke it up and they brought just the regs before the planning commission, even because their MOU wasn't done. And the rationale, of course, for that is the MOU is really regulatory. It was successful in Arapahoe.
Yeah, so assuming that the planning commission recommends the board of planning commissioners when they approve the regulations, sends the MOU outline. Then what do you have to work on?
Well, the MOU is individual anyway, with the applicants. Right. They wouldn't really adopt the MOU anyway. They would, because it's really just a, here's an example of what it might look like.
Well, I think we have to have some representation. The problem with breaking it up, is you're not presenting the public.
And that may be true. I don't know that I got a real accurate read on that because no public showed up.
Well,
they were all at Fort Collins.
Well, no, but I'm not talking about here. I'm talking about here.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying.
Listen, I know we have this April deadline. What are they going to do with the name? Dock our pay? What are they going to do?
Well, I don't know the idea that we should.
We were
rates locked down.
Yes. I think
it's set our.
Well, I'd rather have the MOU done, but you know, Alvarado wasn't working on it longer than we have.
What I'm saying is,
They're
we should
still on
focus our time primarily on getting the regs ready to go so that we're forced to go to the meeting. And we at least have those done. And then once we're having those regs, then we can concentrate on the MOU. But I don't wanna have to.
It was like.
Because I think right now, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, that was the information.
I don't want to be in a position where we are forced to take two incomplete documents.
No, I'd like to make two complete documents.
Yeah, but if we only have time to get one done.
But this timeline is completely artificial.
Well, we don't do this documents right now. In fact, I think it's a mistake because it's too late again, people are tired. I'm just saying, let's think about it, and I had never even thought of it until I saw it.
Just for conversation, I'm not trying to negotiate it, is much of the MOU, we've talked about it ad nauseum, well, we're talking about the regulations, so my great hope is never satisfied, but is that much of this stuff should be
quicker, cleaner, shorter, literally. But I agree, getting one done, that's just your point, go before the board, if there's one without the other.
Well, it makes us look kind of
Crazy.
I'm not particularly overview.
So you don't need to bring lawyers in.
This is the law.
Because they're so good. Oh, and then we should go back and change something. We gotta go back and
What is it? Good operation.
corollary.
No, I just I'm not going to go something here to the solo. It gives them it's not a look at them.
If you don't put
I mean, here we have this regulation, we doesn't have, we already said that.
Is it supposed to be associated with this? There's not much of a change. They use tractor FOU is, and the guy who lies there, it's debates, but so they didn't sit down and look at it.
Of course, it becomes huge.
You pass the regs
And
without.
then it goes to work by the dump truck and it goes to.
No,
No, the question of being transparent. I think they're right. But just in terms of, I mean, I'd rather have
Very, very, very
if
little.
we're going into a public.
These are fresh water.
You know, I said, and what you at least have to show them.
No, I agree with you. And really about this is it's a draft document anyway.
Exactly.
We want to be proud of it.
Exactly.
And,
Been bullying you or?
to be frank with you, I'm not interested in spending a whole lot of time on the MOU until we get the regs done.
We're almost there.
I think we're very close. I think so.
See, earlier you were saying, oh, we got the regs. Except for one thing.
Yeah, we
I tried to get you to
Oh, come on, Brandon.
Yeah.
well, you know,
I'm overwhelmed. I've got to.
but, you know,
And now I've got the.
if we stay on task, I think we're close.
No, I agree.
To my office every day. Every day.
Is that the people that are sacrificed by?
Another day.
Almost 6 months, it's so early, isn't it? Yeah.
Probably was a yellow.
This weekend we're down to,
Are you gonna spring and yellow?